Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Night Fear. I know many of you listen to these stories to help you fall asleep. So, before you get settled in, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from. And if you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and begin. Almost a century ago, my grandparents lived in a large Victorian house in a small town on a naval base in southern England. The street they lived on was a long terrace of houses, stretching for several hundred yards without any turns or side streets. My grandfather was away on a long deployment at sea, and my grandmother, with my father as a very young baby, had left their home. This would have been sometime in 1925 or maybe 1926. My grandmother knew everyone on the street, at least by sight. The house was split into two flats. My grandparents lived upstairs, while a separate family, whom I'll call the Cooks, lived on the ground floor. When you entered through the front door, there was a large hall with stairs leading up to a landing. The door to the upstairs flat was at the top of the stairs, while the downstairs flat had its own entrance a little further down the hall. My grandmother would often place my father's pram in an alcove near the door, tucked out of sight. One afternoon, around midday, my grandmother heard a sharp knock at the door. Surprised, but thinking it might be Mrs. Cook, she opened it only to find no one there. Puzzled, she stepped onto the landing and looked down to see Mrs. Cook standing outside her own door. The two women exchanged glances. "Did you knock?" my grandmother asked. "No," Mrs. Cook replied. "I was just coming out to see who knocked on my door." As they looked around, they both noticed a man dressed entirely in brown, leaning over and peering into my father's empty pram. He didn't turn to face them, but when he straightened up, he walked away. Neither woman had seen his face clearly. Surprised, they quickly followed him, but by the time they reached the street, there was no sign of the man. The man's clothing was described as a brown overcoat, brown trousers, and a fedora-style hat. What was even stranger was that both women realized, after comparing their experiences, that the knock on the door had happened at the exact same time for both of them. Fast forward about 54 or 55 years. I was about 14 or 15 years old by then, growing up in a small West Country city with a much larger industrial town nearby. I had 3 sisters, 2 older, 1 younger. My sisters all went to school locally, except for me. Having passed the 11+ exam, I went to the boys' grammar school in the neighboring town. At this point, my eldest sister was away at university, and my second eldest had started working. This meant my youngest sister was usually the first to get home from school. I'd often arrive around 4:30 p.m. depending on the buses. Our house was a large end-of-terrace home at the top of a hill. Inside, there was a hallway with stairs on the right, leading up to the first floor. The hall continued down toward the kitchen, with the front room to the right and a living room behind it, connected to the kitchen. Now, I know it might sound strange, but despite being born in that house, it always felt like the house had moods. Sometimes, I didn't like being alone there. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe something else, but I could never quite shake the feeling. One afternoon, I returned home as usual. I called out, expecting my younger sister to answer, but she wasn't there. It struck me as odd, but I figured she must have gone down to the local high street. Still, the quiet of the house fell off. I decided to go into the living room and, for some reason, didn't walk straight down the hall to the kitchen. As I passed the doorway to the kitchen, I was suddenly hit by a very strong smell of roses. It was overpowering and seemed to come from nowhere, right in that spot. The scent was so intense that it almost made me feel ill. The strange part was that when I moved my head left or right, the smell would disappear, but standing in that exact spot, it was almost suffocating. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. The air in the room felt heavy, and I didn't like the atmosphere at all. I decided to go outside and wait for my sister to come home. It was cold out there, and I don't remember the exact time, but I know I waited a good 15 or 20 minutes before she finally returned. When I saw her walking up the hill, I went down to meet her. Normally chatty and full of energy, she seemed unusually quiet, and I figured she must have had a rough day at school. We went inside together, and everything seemed normal after that. Mom and Dad came home a little while later, and that was the end of it. A few days later, I mentioned the smell of roses to my sister. That's when I found out about her own experience from the night before, something I had no idea about. She told me that the previous night, she had woken up suddenly. As she lay there, she sensed something in the room, but couldn't see it. What she did feel, though, was the overwhelming scent of roses. The smell seemed to fill the room, and though she was terrified, she stayed very still, hardly daring to breathe. Gradually, the presence faded, and she managed to fall back asleep. The next day, when she came home, she opened the front door and was hit with the same smell of roses again. Unsettled, she decided not to go inside and instead went to the local Woolworths to wait until I would be home. She was surprised to find me outside, but didn't connect the two events until I mentioned the roses. So that's it. No clear answers, no reason to at all, but it's true. A few years ago, I stumbled upon an old belief from Welsh families, who claimed to be haunted by a spirit or a presence that appeared with the distinct smell of roses. When the spirit was sighted, it was often described as wearing brown clothing. My family has a Welsh surname, though we left the valleys 150 years ago. Could it be that something followed us, something that still watches over us in some strange way? It all began on the morning of May 26th. As usual, I went to wake my mom up around 9 a.m. I always do this on weekends. When I entered her room, she seemed a little confused and asked, "Did you come into my room earlier?" At first, I was just as confused and replied, "No, why?" She told me that she had heard me enter her room and even felt the weight of me lying on the bed. She said I asked her to come downstairs, to which she responded that she would in 5 minutes, before going back to sleep. I used to do this when I was younger, waking her up in the mornings, though it had been at least 5 years since then. It seemed a little funny at first, but then I started to feel uneasy. I didn't think much of it until later, when I remembered something strange about our house. It was directly next to a graveyard and a crematorium. That thought lingered in my mind. Could it be the spirit of a child from the cemetery? I've always been a believer in the paranormal, so the possibility crossed my mind. The next day, we had planned to visit my aunt's flat. I woke up later than usual, and when I went downstairs, my mum was already in the kitchen. I greeted her, and again, she asked, "Did you come into my room earlier?" I felt a chill run through me and asked why. She said that, once again, she had heard me at about the same time as the day before. But this time, I had asked, "Mummy, aren't we going to Auntie's house today?" I hadn't called her Mummy in years. That really sent a shiver down my spine. We told my aunt about what had happened when we arrived at her flat. We all shared our thoughts. My mum thought she had been half asleep, while my aunt suggested it might have been a ghost trying to imitate me. At that point, I started to feel unsettled, like something was watching us. To make light of it, I tried to joke around, but inside, I couldn't shake the feeling of being creeped out. That night, my mind was consumed by what had happened. I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I started to feel a sense of regret for making fun of the spirit. I decided to apologize out loud, just in case it could hear me. After a while, I managed to fall asleep. Strangely enough, I didn't dream at all, and I didn't wake up once during the night, which was unusual for me, as I suffer from insomnia. The next morning, around 9 a.m., I woke up to a soft pat at the end of my bed. The moment it happened, I knew. My apology must have attracted the spirit. Though I was scared, I didn't feel in danger, just unsettled. My blanket was covering my face, and I was lying on my back, which I never do. I usually sleep on my side or stomach. I tried to sit up, thinking maybe my cat had jumped on the bed, but as soon as I tried, I found myself caught in sleep paralysis. When I finally broke free, my room was empty. I rushed downstairs to tell my mum, but she just brushed it off, saying I was overthinking and had scared myself. Her explanation made sense, so I decided to stop thinking about it, convinced that I had just been imagining things. But on the fourth day, something happened again. I woke up to the sound of a loud, heavy sigh coming from my doorway. It sounded just like my mom when she's annoyed. I assumed it was late and she was trying to wake me up. But when I got up, there was no one there. Later that day, I spoke with my cousin about everything that had been happening. She suggested that maybe we had attracted this energy because of a significant change happening in our lives. I won't go into the details, but our home life was about to change dramatically later that week. My cousin wondered if the spirit had been there to comfort me. While we were talking, I set my phone down, screen facing upwards. As I gave my cat a treat, I looked back down at my phone and noticed it had flicked to my cousin's profile picture. No one had touched the screen. It could only have been done if the image had been tapped. I thought to myself, is the spirit curious? Perhaps it wanted to know who I was talking to. So, I spoke to it, telling it that my cousin meant no harm and wasn't trying to upset anyone. And that was the last strange event. Since then, things have been calm. Throughout all of this, I never felt threatened by the spirit. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It all began a long time ago, when I was around 8 years old, living in an old house in Staffordshire, England, in the late 1970s. I shared a bedroom with one of my older brothers, and there was always something off about that house. Strange noises filled the air at night, footsteps, things moving in the loft, and an eerie feeling that I was being watched. I couldn't see anything, but I could always feel it. One night, I woke up in my bed to an overwhelming weight on my legs. At first, I thought it was just my cat, but when I looked, there was nothing there. The room was pitch black, and the weight quickly vanished. The blankets lifted as though something had just gotten up from the bed. I froze, terrified. It didn't feel like just a draft or my imagination. Something was there. After that night, I couldn't sleep the same way again. Every time I went to bed, I pulled the covers over my head, hoping it would keep whatever it was away. But the noises continued. The sounds from the loft were always the same, a heavy chest being dragged or something scraping the floor. It never stopped. One evening, my brother came into the room, ready to go to bed. He saw that I was still awake and asked me why. I told him about the strange sounds in the loft, so we both stayed up, listening in the dark. Suddenly, we heard it again, the dragging sound, as if something heavy was being moved in the loft above us. We lay there in silence, too scared to speak. Eventually, we both drifted off to sleep, but the noises didn't stop. Then, one night, it got worse. We heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, moving down toward us. I was sure someone else was awake, but when we checked, no one was there. My brother went downstairs to see if anyone was up, but he returned a few minutes later, saying the house was empty. All the lights were off, and it was still. We decided to wait, and a few minutes later, the footsteps began again, but this time they came back up the stairs, stopping outside our room. They moved down the hallway and past each bedroom, then everything went silent. We both lay there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I finally told my mom about it, but she shrugged it off, saying it was just the heating system. But I knew there was something more, something that didn't feel right. The months went by, and the strange noises continued. One day, I noticed something odd on my bedroom wall. New wallpaper had been put up not long before, but now there were burned, hoof-like marks embedded in it, stretching down from the ceiling to the spot where my head would usually be. I didn't tell anyone at first, but when I showed my older brother, even he couldn't explain it. We just kept quiet about it. One night, I was too scared to go upstairs by myself to use the bathroom. I asked my mom if she could wait at the bottom of the stairs while I went, but she told me I was old enough to go alone. I hesitated but made myself walk slowly up the stairs, a hall light casting long shadows on the walls. When I reached the top, I felt compelled to look at the loft door. It was shut tight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was behind it. I quickly went into the bathroom, locked the door, and waited. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Then, I heard a scraping sound just outside the door. I called out, "Who's out there?" but no one answered. My heart was racing, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. After what felt like an eternity, I slowly unlocked the door and opened it. The loft door was now slightly ajar. I stood frozen on the landing, staring at the gap in the door. The loft was completely dark, but then, something terrifying happened. Two glowing red eyes appeared, staring down at me from the blackness. I couldn't move. I was frozen with fear, unable to speak. The eyes came closer, but somehow, I managed to break free from the trance-like state. I crouched down, gripped the top step of the stairs, and started to move down, step by step. It felt as if something was holding me back, keeping me from escaping, but just as suddenly as it started, the grip released, and I was able to run downstairs into the living room, shaking with fear. I didn't say anything to anyone. I didn't want to talk about what had just happened. Eventually, we moved to a more modern house in Staffordshire. For a while, things seemed normal again. But in 1987, when I was 16, we moved to a Victorian house in Wales. At first, everything seemed fine, but soon enough, the strange occurrences returned. One night, as I tried to sleep, I was once again woken by a heavy weight on my legs. This time, it felt like an animal moving around on the bed. It sniffed and shifted around, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. After a few minutes, I kicked at it, and it made a loud thump as it fell to the floor. I quickly turned on the light, but there was nothing there. I kept the light on all night, too scared to turn it off. Weeks later, I heard two voices, one on each side of my bed, talking in whispers. The next night, the heaviness returned, but this time, something moved closer to my face. I could feel a cold, hot sensation rush through my body as it slowly approached. When it got near enough, I heard a whisper in my ear. I couldn't make out the words, but I froze, unable to move. After what felt like an eternity, the presence moved away, and I saw a pale blue orb, the size of a small plate, disappear through the door. A few days later, I met a medium who told me something unsettling. He said that something was following me, a 6-foot, dark figure that was incredibly powerful. He couldn't see it clearly, but he said it wasn't there to harm anyone. It needed me to take it somewhere it could seek revenge. Since then, the feeling of being watched has never fully gone away. Even in my new home, I sometimes hear strange sounds outside my door. And when I go to bed, I can't shake the feeling that something is still with me, waiting in the shadows. In November 2002, something strange happened. One night, my son, my brother, and I were walking to the 24-hour garage. As we passed a house, we noticed an old woman standing outside, crying. She said she was trying to get in, but there was no answer. She asked if we had any change for the phone, but when we tried to help, she told us not to touch her. We didn't think much of it at the time, but when we returned, she had vanished. The following year, we walked by the same spot, and the same woman was there, crying and asking for help again. It felt as though we were seeing a ghost, someone who was stuck, unable to move on. Years later, my son woke up in the middle of the night and told me that he had seen a tall, dark figure standing beside my bed. He tried to wake me up, but before he could, he fell back asleep. There's one more strange encounter I remember, during a stay at a holiday apartment. My girlfriend and I were lying in bed, chatting before sleep, when she suddenly complained that something was poking her. I thought she was joking, but she insisted it wasn't funny. We turned on the light, but nothing was there. Then, her phone started playing music on its own, a song called Unbreakable. We didn't touch it. We both felt a chill, and then heard a growl from the side of the bed. We both froze, unsure of what to do. After a few minutes, we turned the light on again, but there was nothing in the room. My husband and I live in Scotland, but we've always been drawn to York for its rich history, charming old pubs, and, of course, its fascinating ghost stories. We've visited many times, but on one of our recent trips, we discovered something new, a haunted house tucked away behind one of the main shopping streets, just off Stonegate. This house had been uncovered and renovated to resemble how it might have looked in centuries past, restored as a family home from long ago. The attraction allowed visitors to wander through the rooms, take photos freely, and listen to a tape recording that shared one of the ghost stories connected to the building. It was an eerie atmosphere, one that felt like it could be the perfect backdrop for a chilling tale. The tour took you up into the seance room, a dark, foreboding space at the top of the house, and through attics that were said to have been used as bedrooms until as recently as the late 1990s. The cellars were particularly spooky, damp, cold, and filled with shadows. Some rooms were less unsettling, but it was in one of these that we had our strangest experience. On our second visit, we brought friends along to share in the thrill. This time, my husband had brought his digital camera, hoping to capture some supernatural evidence, perhaps an orb or two, or even some ectoplasm if we were lucky. The first part of the tour was uneventful, but when we reached a small wainscot room, something unusual happened. This room was cozy, with wood paneling and a small fireplace. The only piece of furniture I remember was a cheval mirror, standing near the center of the room. I stood in front of it and asked Tom to take a photo of me. He snapped the picture and checked the display. His face went pale, and he said, "Now that's weird." I looked at the screen, and instead of seeing my reflection or the reflection of the room, there were only thick, streaky lines of fog. It looked almost like what you might imagine ectoplasm to look like, swirling and ghostly. We were both stunned. The atmosphere in the room felt suddenly heavier, but our friends had already moved on, so we decided not to show them just yet. Instead, I asked Tom to take another photo. This time, it came out as expected, just a normal shot, with my reflection in the mirror and the room behind me. We finished the tour without anything else out of the ordinary happening. Afterward, we headed to our favorite pub in York, eager to check out the strange photo. Naturally, we told our friends what had happened, and they were just as curious as we were to see the picture. Tom pulled up all the photos he had taken that day, including the one with the foggy streaks in the mirror. But when he scrolled through them, the image of the ectoplasm was gone. It wasn't in the camera's memory. We even checked the deleted photos, but nothing was there. We all knew that it's almost impossible to accidentally delete a photo. Cameras usually ask you to confirm before doing so. So what had happened to it? We were all left with a strange, unsettling feeling. On our next visit to York, we returned to the same haunted house attraction, hopeful that we might experience something similar. This time, my camera didn't capture anything unusual, and the visit was fairly uneventful. But a little while later, as I was browsing the attraction's website, I stumbled across a post from another visitor. Someone had shared a photo of the same mirror from that room, and much to my surprise, it looked strikingly similar to the foggy one we had taken. That eerie feeling crept back into my spine. Sadly, that haunted house is now closed, replaced by a shop on Stonegate. But every time we walk past it, my husband gets a strange sensation. He's sensitive to these things, and he's often noticed that his palms get sweaty or tingly, and he feels lightheaded when he's near the area, especially where the seance room once stood. We didn't have any direct experiences there on our previous visits, but the place still seems to hold an energy, one that lingers long after the doors have closed. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. It was a quiet Tuesday night, and my boyfriend and I, both living in a small town with not much to do, decided to just drive around. After stopping by his house for a while, we drove to a graveyard that was only about 2 minutes away from his place. The graveyard sat on a large hill, with a gravel road that circled around it. We parked at the very top, right next to a patch of woods. There was a big, old tree in the center of the graveyard, so we walked over to it and just started talking, enjoying the peace of the night. But after a little while, I started to feel strange. It wasn't anything specific, just a growing sense that something wasn't right. I noticed my boyfriend seemed off too. He was acting a little strange, fidgety, almost as if he was on edge. Then we heard the sound of a truck. It was pulling up the hill, slowly. We decided it was time to leave. But when we turned to head back to the car, the truck didn't stop. It backed down the hill and then started going back and forth, driving in circles on the road, almost as if it was waiting for us to leave. After a few minutes, the truck parked at the bottom of the hill. We were still standing under the tree, but now we were both uneasy. Just then, we heard a noise from the woods. It was faint, not loud, but enough to make us both turn to look. My boyfriend suddenly became even stranger, almost like he was afraid. He hurried me into the car and insisted I sit on his side of the car, not the side next to the woods, as if he didn't want me anywhere near it. When we drove down the hill, I noticed the truck was still there, parked at the bottom, turning around in the gravel. My boyfriend started cussing under his breath because the truck was moving so slowly. Then, when the truck finally pulled out, it drove right beside us. The driver was an old man. I remember his face clearly. It was pale, with a weird expression that I can't explain, almost like he was lost in thought or deeply sad. He didn't look at us, didn't acknowledge us at all. He just stared straight ahead, and the whole moment felt like it was in slow motion. When we got to the bottom of the hill, my boyfriend was acting even more strange. He started driving erratically, knocking over people's mailboxes and acting out in a way I'd never seen before. It was almost like he was angry, like something had taken control of him. After a while, he calmed down, and by the time he dropped me off at my house, he was back to his sweet self. That night, he called me, and I couldn't help myself. I had to ask him about the graveyard, the truck, and the strange things that had happened. But he wouldn't tell me much. All I managed to learn was that the area around the graveyard was known for being home to some very unsavory people, including members of the KKK. And then he dropped a bombshell. He confessed that he had once driven up there and saw something horrible, something involving a black woman hanging from the very tree we had been standing under. I asked him about the truck that had been there when we left, but he swore there had been no truck. He even got mad at me for asking, cursing and insisting that I was imagining things. I didn't imagine it, though. I knew what I saw. I remembered him getting mad and yelling at the driver. Why would I imagine that? My boyfriend begged me not to go back to that graveyard, not to go anywhere near the tree again. He wouldn't tell me much more, but he did admit that he knew something was out there, something in the woods. He wouldn't tell me exactly what it was, but he told me that if you wait long enough under that tree, whatever it is will come out. And chances were, I wouldn't make it back. He showed me scars, deep, ugly marks on his body, and told me that he'd done it before, gone up there and waited. But whatever came out of those woods had left its mark on him. He was terrified, and the more I pressed him about it, the more upset he got, practically begging me not to go back there. But the truth was, I had to know. There was something about that graveyard, something about that tree, that I couldn't shake. The secret was too powerful, too strange, and I couldn't let it go. I had to know what was out there, even if it meant risking my life. So, one of my friends and I decided we would go back next weekend. We were going to wait under that tree for as long as it took. I had to find out for myself, even if it killed me. I had shared some of my paranormal experiences before, ones that led me to develop a heightened sense of psychic awareness. At the time, I was living just outside of Austin, Texas, in the hill country, near a place called Will Creek. It was named after a settler, Will Barger, who'd been involved in the fight for Texas independence. Interestingly, my ancestors, the Kickapoo, had scalped him, but he survived to tell the tale. Eventually, I had to move from the house on my 6-acre plot to a smaller 3-acre property a few miles away. The land I left behind was surrounded by dense woods, with an open meadow near the house, a place where musicians and people with metaphysical interests would gather for all-night jam sessions and storytelling. It was a place filled with memories, and an energy that could only be described as spiritual. The spring of 1997 had been particularly rainy, and the mud made it difficult to access the house. I had to park on the main road and trudge down a dirt path leading through the property. One evening, just as dusk was settling in, I headed back to my truck, a 1964 Chevy. The air felt heavy, charged with electricity, as if something was about to happen. As I walked, I saw what I thought was a figure standing in the middle of the road, a dark, hooded shape. As I got closer, it turned and disappeared into the woods. When I reached the spot where it had been, a chill ran down my spine, and I could almost feel the presence that had passed through. Later, when I walked past that same spot on my way back, the cold sensation returned, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't stay at that place for long after that. I moved to my new home, nestled deeper in the woods on a smaller plot of land. There was an old barn that had been moved to the location, and a dirt road that wound its way through the trees. The road didn't look like a typical farm path, there were no tire tracks, and it seemed more like a forgotten trail leading into the woods. One afternoon, my mother visited from Houston. She mentioned seeing a man in a flannel shirt walking toward the house from the barn. I looked out the window, but no one was there. My two wolf dogs, who would usually bark at the slightest hint of someone approaching, hadn't reacted either. Later, as I was working on my truck, I could sense someone nearby, watching me. When I looked up, I saw something strange, what looked like a figure dissolving in the air, as if it had evaporated when I looked at it. The presence lingered, but it wasn't solid. Another night, I was inside the house when a peculiar scent filled the air, patchouli oil. It wasn't something I used, nor had anyone else been in the house. Then, I noticed another scent, one that seemed to belong to a woman. It wasn't exactly a physical smell, but something more ethereal, like an astral presence. To clear the air, I decided to smudge the house and went for a walk with my dogs down the dirt road. It was a quiet, moonlit night when I heard something that made my skin crawl, a woman's laugh, sharp and mocking, coming from the woods behind my house. I quickly looked around, but there was no one in sight. The laughter still echoed in my mind, sending chills through me. That weekend, I went to the barn at night, hoping to understand more. It was a clear, crisp evening, and the stars above the hill country felt so close, almost within reach. Standing near a tree, I noticed a mist swirling above me, drifting off to my right. When I turned to look at it, it vanished. Something about the area felt off. I couldn't shake the sense of a man being near, but he wasn't dressed in modern clothes, he was wearing buckskin, like someone from the early 1800s. Then, I sensed a strange fold in the space around me, a shift in time, as if the very air was different here. It was hard to explain, but psychics like me are sometimes able to feel things others might miss. As I looked deeper into the history of the land, I learned more. The barn was over 100 years old, part of the old Spanish Trail, and Will Barger had once owned a store nearby. My neighbors, who had known each other for decades, told me stories of the land and the people who lived there long before Texas gained independence. They confirmed that Will Barger had indeed survived being scalped by the Kickapoo, and that the area had been a battleground for various tribes, including the Comanche and Cherokee. When I brought a psychic friend to the barn, she also sensed a violent energy, like someone had been trying to kill someone there. I still live here, and though I haven't found any concrete answers, I occasionally feel the presence of something or someone. Sometimes it feels like a woman's spirit, or maybe several different people from different time periods. It makes me wonder if the woman I once heard laughing in the woods is connected to the same spirit I felt when I was 18, calling my name. My mother, who saw the man near the barn, said he didn't seem like someone from the early 1800s, and that he wasn't wearing clothes from that time. And yet, when I think about the year 1836 and the buckskin, I know that there's something to it. I often gaze out my kitchen window at the dirt road, imagining the people who once traveled it long ago, horse-drawn wagons, pioneers, and settlers. I'm still learning about this land, still investigating, and I'm sure there's more to discover. Maybe one day, I'll have more to tell. Back in 1992, I was stationed in England as an airplane mechanic. When I first arrived at the base, I was told something that stuck with me: England is the most haunted country on earth, don't be surprised if you see something. They shared all sorts of local ghost stories, some seemed a bit far-fetched, while others were more chilling. Because there was no available base housing, I had to rent a place off base. The closest village I could find was called March, about 35 miles north of the base. It sat on the edge of the moors, a vast, flat stretch of drained swampland used by farmers to grow sugar beets and potatoes. The land was eerily empty, dotted with patches of fog that never seemed to lift, and hedgerows and small forests that protected the fields from wind erosion. Driving through the moors at night always felt a little unsettling, and I breathed a sigh of relief whenever I finally made it through. One of the things I got used to in the area was picking up hitchhikers. It was a sort of unwritten rule in the village, explained to me by my English neighbor, that many of the local farmers and factory workers used hitchhiking as their only way to get to work or back home. It was a small service I didn't mind doing, and I even made some lasting friendships this way, something I definitely wouldn't have done back in the US. One night, around 2 a.m., I was driving home from work, passing through the moors. The fog was particularly thick that night, and visibility was almost non-existent. I'd drive 300 yards through total blindness, only to come out into a small patch of clear sky for a few moments before the next fog bank swallowed me up again. I had just emerged from one of those thick patches when I noticed something strange on the side of the road, a man standing there, dressed in bluish-gray coveralls, with what looked like a welder's helmet on his head. Under his arm was a torn, grayish-white sheet trailing behind him, like some kind of ghostly shroud. I slowed down as I passed, wondering if he was lost. He didn't acknowledge me at all, and something about him made me feel uneasy. It was late, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would be out there in the moors at this hour. Against my better judgment, I decided to stop and offer him a ride. I reversed the car slowly, hoping he might get in. As I turned to unlock the passenger door, something odd happened. The car's headlights and dashboard lights flickered, then went dim. The engine started to sputter, and the car ran rough. I quickly scanned the dashboard, looking for any warning lights, but there was nothing. Just as quickly as the trouble started, the power came back, and the car ran smoothly again. I turned back to check on the hitchhiker, but he was gone. I was confused. What's going on? Where did he go? I muttered to myself. I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and got out of the car, thinking he might have fallen into a ditch or wandered off into the fog. I searched the area for about 2 minutes, but there was no sign of him anywhere. The air around me felt unnaturally still, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. My heart started to race, and a wave of goosebumps swept over me. I didn't waste another moment. I jumped back in the car, telling myself that I needed to get out of there, fast. A few days passed, and I didn't mention the incident to anyone. I figured maybe I had been more tired than I realized, what with the long hours at work and the long drive home. But then, a few days later, something happened that made my blood run cold. I was driving through the moors again, when I saw that the British police had blocked off the road. I stopped to ask what was going on. The officers explained that a farmer had found an old German bomber from World War II, a Heinkel 111, crash-landed in the moors. The crew was still on board. Curious, I made my way toward the crash site. As I approached, I couldn't help but notice the crew members. The wreckage was morbid, but what caught my attention were their clothes. They were wearing bluish-gray coveralls, much like the man I had seen in the moors, and their helmets looked exactly like a welder's cap. One of the crew members had a parachute nearby, torn, shredded, and grayish-white, with the trailing ends of it floating in the air like the bedsheet I had seen earlier. The eerie resemblance was impossible to ignore. I couldn't shake the thought that the man I had picked up in the fog that night wasn't just a random stranger. Maybe he had been trying to find his way home. My mother's house in North Miami Beach has more cats than I've ever seen in any other home. Over the years, she's had cats of all breeds and colors, each one unique in its personality. They were all part of the family, and even though I no longer live there, I still think of them as my family. But one particular cat, through strange circumstances, has stayed with me in a way the others haven't. About 2 years ago, I was visiting my mom. She was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, so I stood by her side, chatting. "Mom," I said, "I can't wait to show you these pictures from my trip to Alaska. I just have a couple of frames left to shoot." "Take a picture of Toon," she suggested, pointing to the little black and white cat curled up by the window. I'd named him Toon because he reminded me of a cartoon character, with his exaggerated expressions and human-like gestures. Toon and I shared a special bond, a kind of owner-pet connection that felt deeper than most. My mom had told me that when I lived at home, Toon would always rush to the door around 6 o'clock, just the time he expected me back from work. He would wait there, almost pacing, and sometimes, he'd even scream all night, meowing in this high-pitched tone as if he were trying to talk. No matter what day it was when I came to visit, he'd be there, waiting excitedly by the door, like he could sense I was coming. I went to grab my camera, and I noticed I had just 2 frames left on the roll of film. I knelt down on the kitchen floor, trying to get a shot of Toon. But he was so excited to see me that he kept darting out of the frame, his little paws moving too quickly for me to focus. Each time I pressed the shutter, he'd already be somewhere else. "I can't get a shot," I said, frustrated, looking up at my mom. She was busy with the stove, her back to me. "He keeps moving." suddenly, I heard a voice. It was a young woman's voice, right next to my ear, clear and crisp. "This is your last chance," she said. I froze for a moment, but then I shook it off. I turned to my mom. "What did you say?" "Take a picture of Monty," she replied, pointing to another cat, a well-behaved red-striped tabby, sitting calmly by the dish rack. I moved over, still feeling a little unsettled, and took the photo of Monty. The voice lingered in my mind, like an echo I couldn't quite shake off. A month later, just before Christmas, I was planning to visit my mom again. I was home alone, watching a sentimental holiday special on TV, when, out of nowhere, a wave of emotion hit me. I started crying uncontrollably, overcome by a strange, unexplainable feeling. Something in me was urging me to call my mom. I told myself it was just the TV show, nothing more than a silly emotional reaction, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It felt like I needed to speak to her, urgently. I tried to ignore it, but the sense of needing to reach out was overpowering, so I gave in and went to bed, still in tears. The next day, my mother called me. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell something was wrong. She told me that the night before, while making her bed, she had noticed that Toon looked strange. His eyes went blank, and then, suddenly, he collapsed. She rushed him to the vet, but it was too late. Toon mysteriously passed away. I sat there on the phone, listening to my mother's voice crack as she spoke. I could feel the tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't say anything right away. I just thought about that voice I'd heard so clearly, and the words it had spoken. It wasn't until later, when I hung up, that I realized how strange the whole thing had been. The voice, the strange feeling I'd had the night before, and then Toon's sudden passing. It all felt connected somehow, in a way I couldn't explain. All I knew for sure was that the voice had warned me it had been his last chance to say goodbye. This is a story that happened to my mother. It might not be the scariest thing you've ever heard, but it's one I'll always remember. I was only 8 years old at the time, fast asleep in my room, so I only have my mother's account of what happened. It was the spring of 1984, just a few minutes after midnight. Everyone in our little one-story house was asleep, everyone except my mom. It was a quiet night, and after a long evening of watching TV by herself, she finally decided to head to bed. Our house had 4 bedrooms, each connected by a narrow hallway. My little brother's room was at the very end of the hallway, while my mom's room was near the front. As my mother lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, she suddenly heard the unmistakable sound of toys rattling. It wasn't faint or distant, it was loud and clear, coming from my brother's room. She thought it was strange at first, but figured that my 5-year-old brother, Greg, had gotten up to play with his toys. After all, it wasn't uncommon for him to get out of bed at night. She called out to him from her room, a little irritated, "Greg, go back to sleep." The sound stopped for a moment, only to start up again, louder this time. The noise of clinking blocks and rolling cars filled the house. My mom was starting to get frustrated, so she decided to go get him and put him back to bed. She got up, walked into the hallway, and turned on the light. The rest of the house was dark, the bedrooms all bathed in quiet darkness. As she moved toward my brother's room, the noise grew louder. But just as she was about to reach the door, the sound suddenly stopped, completely. When she opened the door to his room, what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Every single toy, every block and car, was neatly stacked in its usual spot, nothing out of place. And my brother? He wasn't there. It turns out that Greg had climbed into my older sister's bed earlier that night, and the 3 of us, my sister, my brother, and I, had all fallen fast asleep in a deep, peaceful slumber. There was no way he could have been the one making all that noise. Mom stood at the door, chills creeping up her spine. She wasn't the kind of person to get scared easily, but this was different. This was something she couldn't explain. Without a second thought, she ran back to her bedroom, locked the door, and called my dad in Maine, trying to tell him what had happened. But here's the strange part, she couldn't get through to him. He wasn't home. It turns out that my dad had flown out to Ohio unexpectedly that evening because my great-grandmother, his grandmother, had passed away just a few hours earlier. When I was 18, I was stationed at Fort Dix, New Jersey, as part of my Air Force security police training. It was the final leg of my military journey, and I remember that time well, not just for the training, but for the unsettling experience I had one night at the base. Before joining the military, I had a close group of friends with whom I shared a deep interest in the paranormal. We dabbled in things like Ouija boards, seances, and psychometry. But once I left home and joined the Air Force, I felt completely disconnected from that world. It was one of the most isolating times of my life. One evening, after a long day of field training, my squadron returned to the barracks, exhausted. We had just enough time to clean up before heading to bed. Our barracks were 2 stories tall with rooms that housed 2 people each, though I was still alone in mine, as I hadn't been assigned a roommate yet. By 11:30, I had finished unpacking and turned off my desk lamp, ready to get some much-needed rest. I fell asleep almost instantly, but sometime later, I woke up with a strange, heavy feeling. It was as if something was in the room with me, something evil. The sensation was suffocating, almost as if several thick blankets were weighing down on me. When I tried to move, I couldn't. My body felt paralyzed, and all I could do was move my eyes. Fear gripped me. Then I saw it. A faint light flickered in the corner of my eye, casting a strange reflection on the wall. The light disappeared almost as soon as it appeared, but then I heard the faint scurrying of tiny creatures, like something was moving on the floor. My heart raced as I forced myself to look at the foot of my bed. What I saw will haunt me forever. At the foot of my bed, there were 3 figures. Though the room was dark, they seemed to emit a sort of dark radiance, as if they were surrounded by a black mist. They were tall, at least 8 feet, and the one in the middle seemed to be the largest. A dry, biting cold radiated from them, and I could hear what sounded like whispered conversation between them. It wasn't a comforting whisper, it felt menacing. The air in the room had become charged, almost electrically so. The warmth that had been in the room earlier had vanished, replaced by an unnerving chill. The figures shimmered, like a mirage, and the tension in the air made it feel like something bad was about to happen. I could feel their hostility. I was terrified. In that moment, I forced myself to look away, focusing on the wall beside me. The next thing I knew, the paralysis lifted. The room had returned to its usual temperature, and the figures were gone. I slowly sat up in bed, my heart still pounding, and cautiously turned on the light. I looked around the room, but everything appeared normal, nothing was out of place. I opened the door and walked into the hallway, hoping to find an explanation. I went up to the dorm guard, who was sitting at his desk, reading a book. I asked him if anyone had come through the hallway recently. He gave me a strange look and told me that no one had passed through the dorm while he was on watch. He even showed me his log sheets to confirm it. I went back to my room, turned off the light, and climbed back into bed. I couldn't explain what had happened, but I wasn't about to tell anyone. After all, I was there to train in the military, not to get sent home for something as crazy as that. This happened to me when I was 7 years old, about 31 years ago, and my sister, who was 11 at the time, was a witness. When my great-grandmother passed away, she left her house to my mother. The house was old, 2 bedrooms, a large dining room that had been converted into a bedroom for my 4 brothers, my sister, and me. Yes, we were a big family. My sister and I shared a twin bed that was placed right next to a window, which was low to the ground, about even with the bed. The driveway ran along the side of the house, made of rock cement with grass growing between the cracks. One of our favorite toys was an old wheelbarrow that had only the metal rim for a tire. For entertainment, we would push each other in it up and down the driveway. I always ended up at the foot of the bed, next to the window, when we played. It was summer, so all the windows in the house were open, letting in the warm night air. One evening, I was awakened in the middle of the night by an odd sound. At first, I couldn't place it, but then I realized what it was, the wheelbarrow being pushed very slowly back and forth, just outside my window. You could hear the metal rim scraping against the rocks in the driveway, the crunching sound growing louder as it moved closer. My heart began to race in fear, and I froze. I couldn't bring myself to open my eyes, but the sound was undeniable, it was the wheelbarrow, moving on its own. To make matters worse, the screen on the window was torn, part of it was pulled away from the frame, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was about to reach in and grab me. Terrified, I finally summoned enough courage to pinch my sister, hoping to wake her up. She was such a deep sleeper that it took 3 tries before she stirred. On the 3rd try, I pinched her as hard as I could. She woke up and asked, "What are you doing?" I pressed my finger to my lips and whispered, "Shoo. Listen." I opened my eyes and looked at her, only to see the whites of her eyes staring back at me. She was just as terrified as I was. She whispered, "On the count of 3, we're running to Mom and Dad's room." I'm not sure if we ever actually counted to 3, but the moment she moved, I jumped up, and we both bolted from the bed. We pounded on our parents' door, frantic, and my mother finally opened it. "What's wrong?" she asked. We quickly explained that we had heard a strange noise outside and that we were scared. My stepfather grabbed a bat, and they both went outside to check. When they came back, he said he had checked the entire perimeter of the house and hadn't seen anything out of the ordinary. I asked him if the wheelbarrow was still in the driveway, and he said, "No, it's not there." The next morning, we found the wheelbarrow in the backyard. No one could explain how it had gotten there, or who or what had been pushing it around in the middle of the night. I've never forgotten that eerie, unnerving experience, and I still wonder about what I heard and what I didn't see outside that window. My mother's side of the family hails from England, and there's an eerie tale tied to one of our relatives, who served as the housekeeper to a certain Lord Breckley. The year was 1856, and Lord Breckley was a wealthy, influential man with a vast estate. He owned several properties, including a grand townhouse in London, where he spent most of his time. Known for his foul temper, Lord Breckley was said to treat everyone in his life poorly, from servants to family, and even the lords and ladies he mingled with. Among his victims was his young mistress, Ailie. Ailie was a strikingly beautiful, wiry girl of Scottish descent, many years his junior. There was much speculation about her origins. Some said she was the illegitimate daughter of a nobleman and a common Scottish woman. She had been Lord Breckley's mistress for 6 years, though their relationship was far from harmonious. One fateful night, an ear-piercing scream shattered the stillness of the house. Lord Breckley and Ailie had been embroiled in a fierce argument, and my relative, the housekeeper, grew concerned for Ailie's safety. The servants, anxious to see what had happened, rushed up the stairs, but they were stopped by Lord Breckley himself. His demeanor was strange. He was visibly shaken and forbade anyone from going upstairs. He claimed that Ailie had simply tripped and cried out, but the servants, having learned to keep quiet or risk losing their jobs, reluctantly returned to their duties, though they were deeply suspicious. The next morning, Ailie was absent from the kitchen, where she usually took her breakfast. The servants began to whisper among themselves, wondering if Lord Breckley had finally gone too far and done away with her in the night. Days turned into weeks, but there was still no sign of Ailie, and life in the townhouse went on as usual until the sounds began. At precisely 10 p.m. every night, the wailing would start. It was a soul-wrenching cry, a woman's voice shrieking and moaning, begging for mercy. The household staff could not ignore it, and after several weeks of sleepless nights, they decided to investigate. On one fateful evening, they followed the direction of the screams, which led them to Lord Breckley's chambers. The master of the house had, by this time, retreated to his country estate in Yorkshire to escape the disturbing noise. Gathering their courage, the servants pushed open the door to his room. What they saw was enough to freeze the blood in their veins. There, in the center of the room, stood Ailie, her eyes hollow and lifeless, her arms stretched out as if pleading for help. The housekeeper stepped forward, her heart racing, and reached for Ailie's hand. For a brief moment, Ailie felt solid, like a living person. But then, in a chilling motion, she pointed toward the closet and, before anyone could react, vanished. After a few moments of stunned silence, the servants hurried to the closet, but no matter how hard they searched, they could not find what Ailie had wanted them to uncover. The housekeeper, trembling, went to Lord Breckley's country house the following day and told him everything. The lord went pale, and, to the shock of everyone, fired the entire staff and put the house up for sale the very next day. Over the years, Ailie's restless spirit continued to haunt the house. Every night, at precisely 10 p.m., her mournful wailing would begin. It always ended with her appearing in the same spot, her arms outstretched, pointing silently toward the closet before vanishing once more. No one ever figured out what had happened to Ailey, nor why her ghost haunted the townhouse. Many speculated that Lord Breckley had murdered her and hidden her body in a secret compartment in the closet, and that he had been horrified when the servants almost discovered his dark secret. But the truth remains unknown. To this day, the house is said to be haunted, and Ailey's cries still echo in the night, unanswered, a grim reminder of her tragic fate. I know a lot of haunted house stories tend to take place in old, spooky homes, out in the middle of nowhere. But this one's different. It happened, and still happens right in the middle of a brand new neighborhood, on the Front Range of Colorado. For months, I heard my friends talk about strange things happening in their new house. The place was only 3 months old when I first started hearing about the ghostly presence, a phantom they said had been watching them. After they had lived there for almost a year, I decided to stay over. I lived a few miles away, and one evening, as it started to get dark and our conversation ended, I figured it'd be a good time to crash there for the night. I grabbed some linens and a pillow, then headed downstairs to the basement. The basement wasn't finished, but it had carpet, a decent bed, and plenty of privacy. It even had a window well. I thought it would be a quiet, peaceful spot to sleep. Around 2 hours after I settled in, I was woken by the sound of distant music. It sounded like it was coming from a small radio on the other side of the house. The house was big, so I figured someone else might be awake and listening to music. Since I was already awake, I decided to get up and see who it was. I threw on some clothes and made my way upstairs. But as soon as I reached the top of the stairs and stepped out onto the main floor, the music stopped, just like that. It was like the rhythm I'd been hearing through the walls suddenly vanished, and everything was silent. That's when things started to feel off. I remembered all the stories I'd heard about the ghost that supposedly roamed the house. At that moment, I felt a chill, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked across the carpet into the kitchen. But as I moved, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. I turned toward the window, expecting the figure to vanish, but it didn't. A shadowy, hollow face of an old man appeared in the window. He was wearing a brown leather jacket and a button cap. He walked past the window, not more than 4 feet away from me, and never even glanced in my direction. What happened next really shook me. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. I watched, frozen, as the figure walked from outside the window into the house. He didn't pass through the wall, but as though the window had no boundaries at all. He moved right through it, then descended into the floor beneath him as if it were a staircase. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. In that moment, I decided I was done. I was leaving. But as I rushed for the front door, something strange happened. A gust of icy cold air hit me, sharp and sudden. It felt like it blew right through me, like a hole had opened up in my stomach. I stopped in my tracks, frozen in place. After what felt like an eternity, I finally found the courage to look around for the door again. But before I could move, I was hit by something even stranger. A puff of white-brown smoke rose up from the floor in front of me. It smelled like cigar smoke, thick and heavy in the air. The odd thing was, the family who lived there was totally opposed to smoking. The smell made me even more uneasy. Then the music came back. Faint at first, then growing louder, like an old big band tune, or singing without words, just sound. A moment later, one of the family members upstairs turned on a light. She walked out of her room, stood at the top of the stairs, and looked down at me in confusion. With a sleepy voice, she asked, "Why are you playing music so early in the morning?" I just shrugged, not sure what else to say, and glanced over at the basement doorway. Within 10 minutes, the rest of the family woke up. They had all heard the music, too. It was strange, because no one had been playing anything. And the smell of cigar smoke? That lingered for a while. Even now, every so often, the family hears the music playing again, or catches a faint smell of smoke in the air. This is a true story, or at least, that's how it was told to me by my grandfather, father, and uncle. They insist that what they saw is absolutely real. But the story doesn't begin with them. It starts about 100 years ago, on a small farm in the hills east of Chillicothe, where my family had lived for generations. My relative, Gerald Barnhart, was a poor man with a large family, about 5 kids. One evening, in early fall, when the leaves were just starting to turn, Gerald's family went to visit some relatives up in Kingston. But Gerald decided to stay behind, planning to fix a loose board in the barn floor. Around supper time, as Gerald worked, he heard someone whistling down the road. He looked up and saw an old peddler coming toward his house, carrying goods on his back. Now, Gerald was a bit of a greedy man, and seeing the peddler made him think of a plan. The weather had turned a little chilly, and he figured it'd be a good idea to invite the peddler in for the night. When the man arrived, Gerald offered him a place to stay. He planned to kill the peddler while he slept and steal everything he had. So, that night, Gerald carried out his plan. Afterward, he buried the peddler's body at the top of a nearby hill, under a huge pile of rocks. When Gerald's family returned, they found the peddler's goods and Gerald told them a story. His family didn't ask too many questions, they were happy to have the new things and just let it go. Years passed, and eventually, Gerald was long gone. But strange things began to happen on that hill where the peddler had been buried. People noticed odd patterns in the weather, wildlife seemed to vanish from the area, and hunters reported feeling like they were being followed. They'd hear footsteps behind them, the crunch of leaves, but when they turned around, there was never anyone there. As the rumors spread, stories began to circulate about a murdered peddler and his vengeful ghost. But the stories were old, and no one knew exactly who had done it or where the peddler was buried. Everyone half believed the stories, but no one wanted to talk too much about it. Despite the strange happenings, no one dared go up the hill. The eerie feeling of being watched was too strong. Yet, my grandfather, father, and uncle decided to visit the spot where the peddler was rumored to be buried. It was another fall day, and the leaves were crunching beneath their boots as they walked through the woods. The trees were bare, and the whole place felt a little too quiet. When they reached the area, they found it, just as the stories had said, a large pile of rocks, piled up like a makeshift grave. Gathering all their courage, the 3 men began to pull the rocks off, layer by layer. But as they worked, they didn't notice the weather starting to change. The sky grew darker, and the wind began to pick up. They didn't realize it, but as they got closer to the last layer of rocks, the weather grew more intense. Suddenly, as they lifted the first rock from the final layer, a bolt of lightning struck the ground next to them. The wind howled, and the trees began to shake violently. It was like the whole world had shifted into something out of a nightmare. And then, from under the pile of rocks, a bright, blinding light began to shine. Terrified, the 3 men quickly shoved the rocks back onto the pile and fled down the hill. The moment they started running, the weather cleared up. The wind calmed, the sky brightened, and the storm seemed to vanish as if it had never been there. From that day on, none of the men who were there that day could ever bring themselves to return to the hill. And to this day, people say the peddler's ghost still roams the hill in search of Gerald Barnhart, following hunters in the fall, waiting for something or someone. This is a story my wife experienced years ago, before I met her. It's not something she likes to talk about, and her son, now 24, doesn't remember much of it, but it's absolutely true. Her son was only about 3 or 4 years old at the time. They had rented a trailer and moved in, and at first, everything seemed normal. That was until one day when her little boy told her that he had made a new friend. Naturally, his mother didn't think much of it. He hadn't really met any kids in the neighborhood yet, so she assumed it was just his imagination. But then, he mentioned his new friend's name, Tommy, and asked if Tommy could have dinner with them. Her first thought was that he had an imaginary friend, which wasn't that unusual for kids. But soon, things started to take a strange turn. At night, she'd put her son to bed, close the door, and settle down to watch TV. But after a while, she'd hear sounds coming from his room, laughter, toy cars rolling across the floor, the kind of noises kids make when they're playing. She thought he'd gotten out of bed and was playing. So, she'd get up, go down the hall, and open the door, only to find her son fast asleep, the room completely silent. The next morning, her son mentioned he hadn't slept well because Tommy had kept waking him up, wanting him to play. She asked him where Tommy was, and he led her to his room, pointing at the closet. When she opened it, there was nothing inside except for something strange. As she moved some clothes hanging in the closet, she noticed what looked like a small child's handprint on the back wall. It wasn't a typical handprint, it looked as if someone had traced around the outside of a hand with a crayon. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. The sounds at night continued, laughter, toys moving, and other noises. Her son became more frightened. He wouldn't sleep, and he'd sit in his bed, crying for his mother to make Tommy go away. Her own mother also heard the strange noises and her grandson's cries of terror. It got so bad that one night, when her son was screaming in fear, she couldn't bring herself to open the door and check on him. One morning, after another sleepless night, she asked her son what Tommy looked like. He told her that Tommy was a little boy, but he was green. He also said that Tommy was getting angry because his parents were outside the window, calling for him to come with them. But Tommy didn't want to go with them because he said his parents were mean and had hurt him. Feeling desperate, she went into her son's room and asked, "Is this the window that Tommy sees his parents through?" Her son nodded. She opened the window and, in a moment of defiance, shouted, "Tommy, if you can't play nicely with my son, then you have to leave. You have to leave anyway. Your parents are waiting for you." The strangest thing happened next. She looked at her son and asked, "Where is Tommy now?" Her son simply replied, "He jumped out the window, and his mom and dad have him now." After that, the strange incidents stopped. The sounds, the cries, everything. They never heard from Tommy again. It's a chilling experience, and even though her son doesn't remember much, she'll never forget it. After hours of driving, we finally arrived at Indian Beach. It's a quiet, peaceful place, no kids playing in the water, no families building sandcastles. Indian Beach is mostly known for its hiking trails. My family decided to have a picnic, so while they set up the food, my aunt and I decided to go for a walk, just for an hour or so. We set off down a trail we found behind a few bushes. It looked like an easy hike, so we decided to follow it. It was around 11 a.m. when we started. The path was lined with bushes and flowers, and we admired everything around us as we walked. Then, we reached a turn and got a glimpse of the ocean, absolutely beautiful. We kept walking, and soon the path narrowed and twisted around a few trees. The trees were so thick that the sunlight barely reached the ground. It felt like we were walking through a tunnel of trees, a cool, dark place, like being inside a cave. We probably should have turned around, but we kept going. As we made our way out of the dark section, we were met with an incredible sight, the sunset over the ocean, stretching out in front of us. We stood there for a moment, just taking it all in. But then, as we turned to continue on our way, we saw something strange. About 4 feet ahead of us, there was a couple, walking hand in hand. I thought to myself, where did they come from? There was only one path. Had they passed us when we were looking at the sunset? We asked them what time it was, and I clearly remember the woman grabbing the man's hand out of his pocket. She looked at his watch and told us, "It's 3:15. I thanked them, and turned to my aunt, saying, "We'd better get going." As we started walking away, I suddenly had this strange feeling, like something wasn't right. The kind of feeling you get when you just know something's off. I asked, where did they go? My aunt suggested, maybe they kept hiking and we just didn't see them leave. But I wasn't so sure. "Let's check," I said. We walked back up the trail, retracing our steps to where we had seen them. But when we got there, they were gone. Just gone. We looked around, trying to figure out where they had gone. There was no other path, just the one we had been walking. They couldn't have just disappeared, could they? We kept walking up the trail, trying to figure out where they could have gone. We turned a corner, and that's when we saw it, a straight drop-off, thousands of feet down to the ocean. I was so grateful for my skid-proof Nikes, or I would have fallen right off the edge. Had the couple fallen too? Had we missed hearing them scream? My heart raced. What happened to them? We stood there for a moment, terrified. I peered over the edge, but they weren't anywhere to be seen. My aunt and I exchanged a look, and without saying anything, we turned and rushed our way back down the trail, not looking back. When we finally reached the bottom, we found my parents, who were having their picnic. They were frantic. "Where have you been?" my mom exclaimed. "It's 5:30. What took you so long?" I was stunned. 5:30? We hadn't been gone that long, had we? We told them about the couple, how they disappeared right in front of us. My mom insisted they must have taken another trail, but I told her there was no other trail. There was nowhere else they could have gone. She just shook her head and said, "They can't just disappear like that. Now pack your things, we're leaving." We never found out who those people were or where they went. But over time, I've come to think that maybe they were warning us about that drop-off, that something had happened to them, and they were trying to keep us from making the same mistake. And just to clarify for anyone wondering, no, I wasn't on any drugs. Let me start by saying that strange experiences run in my family, on my mother's side, at least. It's something that's been passed down through generations. I've had my share of experiences, but I'll share one in particular for now. This happened about 6 years ago in a 2-story townhouse in Studio City. The price was too good to pass up, and I felt lucky to find it. It didn't take long for me to realize why the rent was so reasonable. It was a hot summer, and my first experience happened one evening when I came home with a friend after dinner. We walked upstairs to my bedroom, and there it was, this strange, white mist hovering in the middle of the room. We both stood there in shock, just staring at it, when it suddenly vanished. The room felt freezing cold. We looked at each other, unable to say anything, and then the air went back to normal. Over the next few days, the house seemed to grow more active. There were constant pounding footsteps up and down the stairs, though no one was ever there. At night, the TV in my room would turn itself on, almost every single night. My sister, who was living with me at the time, finally told me about some strange experiences she'd been having too. She would often feel like a small child was crawling into her bed at night, holding tightly onto her. It didn't scare her at first, but the things happening to me only got worse. It became more aggressive. Soon, my sister moved out, and I was left to live there alone. That's when things took a darker turn. I began waking up in the middle of the night, unable to move, like something was physically holding me down. I could barely breathe, paralyzed with fear. It was like something was pressing down on me, keeping me from escaping. I knew then that I had to find a roommate. My lease wasn't up yet, and finding someone wasn't difficult, since the place was in a desirable area. A co-worker moved in, but she didn't last long. One evening, around 9 p.m., the police showed up at the house. My neighbor had called them because he saw a man dressed in strange clothes lying on my roof, peering into my window. When the police arrived, the man was gone, vanished into thin air. A couple of nights later, my neighbor saw the same thing again. He yelled at the man, but instead of running, the figure slowly stood up, walked toward the edge of the roof, and then disappeared. That's when the loud stomping started. Every single night, at 3 a.m., we'd hear footsteps on the roof, heavy and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. My roommate had reached her breaking point. One night, I was woken by her screaming. She'd seen a dark figure standing in her doorway. Her boyfriend turned on the light, and when we looked at the floor, there was a huge, wet red spot, as if blood had spilled onto the carpet. No matter how much we cleaned it, the stain came back every night. She moved out shortly after. But the final straw came one night when I was having a nightmare. In the dream, I was being attacked by a huge man. I woke up suddenly, terrified, and found that my bed was violently shaking. My head was hitting the wall repeatedly, as if something or someone was throwing me around. When it finally stopped, I saw bloody scratches on my stomach and legs, and a huge lump on my head. The thing is, I've never been able to grow my nails past the tips of my fingers. I couldn't have done this to myself. That was when I knew I had to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, and I haven't looked back. Sometimes, when I drive through Studio City, I'll pass by that townhouse and see that it's up for rent again. I always wonder who would want to live there now. I had been working at St. Francis Hospital for about a year at that point. I worked different shifts, but this night I was on the graveyard shift, from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It had been a quiet night, and by 3:30 a.m., I was pretty sure my partner was somewhere snoozing, as working as a security officer in a large hospital wasn't exactly exciting. I decided to head into the basement to sit and read the paper. No one except the security guards ever went down there, so it was a good place to relax for a bit. The basement was huge, about 100 yards by 100 yards, filled with old medical equipment, boxes of documents, and a tangle of random junk. Right in the middle of the mess were 4 old recliners that had been used in the waiting rooms upstairs. This was a spot I frequented, and on the graveyard shift, I could always pick whichever chair I wanted. I chose a big green recliner, sat down, and opened up the paper. I had barely started reading when I got the strange feeling that someone was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing. That's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. It was like something was there, just out of sight, and it made me uneasy. Without thinking, I tried to stand up, but that's when things got weird. It felt like something, was holding me down, like large, strong hands were gripping my wrists and ankles, keeping me glued to the chair. Now, I'm no small guy, I weigh about 200 pounds and stay in good shape, but the pressure was so intense that, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move. I could barely even twitch a finger. The only thing I could move were my eyes, which were darting around the dark, cluttered basement in panic. I don't know how long I was stuck there, but it felt like forever. I was terrified. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the pressure released. In an instant, I was thrown out of the chair, like I was catapulted across the room. I flew at least 15 feet before crashing to the floor, and I don't even think I hit the ground before I was on my feet, running out of there. I didn't stop until I was safely sitting in the ER for the rest of my shift. At 6:30 a.m., the radio crackled with the usual call for me to open the computer room in the basement. I waited for the staff to show up, not wanting to be alone down there. As I left the basement, I couldn't help but glance back at the chair. It was rocking back and forth, as if my struggle had somehow set it in motion. Then, I noticed something that caught my eye, a sparkle in the seat of the chair. I walked over and found a half-carat diamond earring, right in the center of the chair. I showed it to a friend of mine, who appraised it and said the setting was at least 50 years old. I had my ears pierced at the time, so I decided to wear the earring. I kept it for about 6 months, taking it off every night and placing it on the counter in my bathroom. But one morning, I went to put it on, and it was gone. I mentioned it to an old Hawaiian man I knew, and he told me that it was probably a female ghost, trying to seduce me. Honestly, if that was her plan, I don't think I had much of a choice. It's the kind of desperate cry that comes with trying to convince people that something strange really happened. My friend Jason Marshall didn't believe in the supernatural at all until one night when he was forced to. That night changed him forever. I've always felt something was off about our front door. It had this weird, hostile vibe. I know it sounds crazy, but every time I got close to it, I feel uneasy. I couldn't explain why. To understand, a little history of the house might help. It was built in the 1920s, and over the years, it had 3 different occupants, all of whom met untimely deaths. The first was a married couple. The husband committed suicide, and just days later, his wife died in a car crash. The second was a young, unwed couple. They moved in, but tragedy struck. One of them died in an accident, and the other took their life. The last couple wasn't any luckier. The wife killed herself, and the husband passed away in a terrible accident. All these deaths were strange, and they seemed tied to the house. My family didn't think much of it, but the front door, well, that door was different. My parents told me it came from England, but I'm not sure if that was true. Our house had a Victorian style to it, and people would often compliment it. But something about that door, it was like it was alive. I moved in about 4 months ago, and since then, I haven't found any peace. Sometimes, I could swear I heard someone calling me from the direction of that door. It wasn't a voice I could hear clearly, but more of a feeling like someone was trying to get my attention. And I'd see things, too. Out of the corner of my eye, I'd see the door, but when I turned around, it was gone. This wasn't just me being paranoid, sometimes the door would literally move. I'd come home and find the door had come off its hinges, but when I went inside, it was back in place. Once, my parents woke up to find the door standing at the foot of their bed. It collapsed onto my dad, and he got hurt. When I called 911, the door was back in its usual place by the time I returned. One night, my friend Jason stayed over because of thick Halloween fog. While we were hanging out, we heard strange knocking sounds on the door, like someone was outside. Jason thought it was just kids playing pranks, but I knew better. After a while, we got freaked out. Jason suggested we leave, but when we got near the door, it was gone. Suddenly, the door came crashing down the stairs. We bolted outside in a panic. I turned around, and of course, the door was back in its place. That night, things got even worse. There were poltergeist-like events. Furniture moving, strange noises. Our neighbors heard it too, and the authorities came to check it out. 4 days ago, November 22nd, we moved out. We couldn't take it anymore. I don't know what was up with that door, why it felt so wrong, or why it attacked my dad, but I do know one thing: the day my dad said he was thinking about replacing it, that's when the door went crazy. Ghosts can come in all shapes and sizes. A door is no exception. Dan and Mike's family had recently moved into a house in a post-World War II neighborhood, homes built for returning soldiers. The brothers had always been cheerful and outgoing, and their parents were a happy couple. But lately, something had changed. Tension was in the air, especially with Mike. From the moment Joe and I entered the house, we knew something was off. I felt an unsettling nausea in my stomach, something I couldn't shake. The tour began upstairs, where Dan's bedroom felt like a safe haven, the sick feeling subsiding. But when we ventured into the basement, it intensified. As we walked down the stairs, the atmosphere thickened, heavy and suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, there were 2 doors, one to a washroom, and the other to Mike's bedroom. As we settled on the couch, facing the TV, we could feel the unease growing. An invisible energy, seeped from Mike's room, pulsating in waves. It was like an electrical current, but sinister. We couldn't ignore it, but we couldn't quite place it either. Then, Mike went to his room to get a video. As he opened the door, the energy exploded into the basement in a rolling wave. I've never felt pure evil before, but I felt it then. Joe grabbed my arm, shouting for us to run. We bolted up the stairs, not stopping until we were outside on the neighbor's lawn, gasping for air, terrified and shaking. Later, we learned the history of the house. It had been on the market for a long time before the Adams family moved in. The original owners, a man who'd returned from Europe after World War II, and his wife, who had worked for the army, had lived there peacefully with their son. But when the boy turned 8, something went horribly wrong. One night, the man snapped. He killed his wife, his son, and then himself in Mike's bedroom. What we experienced that day, whether it was the lingering malevolent energy of the man or something older, will never be clear. But we knew one thing for certain: the house was not a place to stay. It's been 6 years since that day. The Adams family has moved, and we've never looked back. I can't bring myself to even wonder how the new occupants are doing. Some things are better left unknown. It was a dark, crisp fall Friday night in Morgantown, West Virginia. The rain had been falling all day, and my girlfriend and I had settled in for a quiet evening, alone in our apartment. The lights were off, and the only glow came from the TV. It was around 10 p.m. when something strange began. At first, everything seemed normal. But lately, we'd been hearing odd things around the apartment: footsteps when no one was around, blurry figures flitting past the window, the faint sounds of the sliding glass door downstairs opening and shutting. At first, we dismissed it. But tonight, something felt different. The silence in the apartment was unnerving. We knew the man who lived below us, and he was usually at work until 11 p.m., so he shouldn't have been home yet. Yet, we had clearly heard his door open and close. A feeling of unease crept over me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I felt a strange mix of fear and adrenaline, as if something was about to happen. My first thought was that it was an intruder, so I grabbed the closest weapon I could find, a broom handle. I opened the door to the inner stairs that led down to the apartment below. The darkness hit me like a wall. It was unnaturally black and still. There was no light, no sound, nothing. My heart pounded. If someone were down there, they'd surely be waiting for me to step into that void. I slammed the door shut again, but just as I did, I heard a terrifying sound, a half-grunt, half-snarl, coming from the other side. My spine went cold with fear. This wasn't an intruder. This was something other. Now, both terrified, my girlfriend and I called the police. When they arrived, they found nothing. The windows were locked, and the door was secure. But when the man from downstairs came home at 11:30 p.m., we shared our story with him. He was baffled but assured us that he hadn't been home early. We spent the rest of the night wide awake, telling ghost stories, too scared to sleep, knowing something unnatural had been in our apartment with us. What a chilling experience you had in that house. The strange happenings, the smell of pipe smoke, the shadowy figure, and the mysterious name appearing in the basement all contribute to an incredibly eerie atmosphere. The house seems to have been filled with more than just history, it seems to have carried something else, too. The appearance of the name Strickland in the basement concrete is particularly fascinating. For something like that to show up when you least expect it, and in a place that had previously been checked, suggests some kind of supernatural imprint left behind. The fact that the name didn't match the historical timeline of the house only deepens the mystery. If the house was that old, it could have been a former resident whose energy had somehow manifested through time. The activities of the animals also speak volumes. Pets are often very sensitive to paranormal energies and can sense things we cannot. The way your dog and cat were acting, looking toward the front door and then toward the back, is a classic sign of sensing an unseen presence. The fact that they, along with you, ran to the back door instead of the front suggests an instinctual reaction to something frightening or unnatural. And the way the front door opened on its own, as though it was inviting you to leave, adds another layer of tension to the whole experience. Your mother's experiences with the pipe smoke and shadowy figure, along with your father's own encounter with a pipe-smoking figure on the stairs, reinforces the sense that the house was haunted by a very specific entity or spirit. The fact that it seemed to take an interest in your family's activities, especially the Christmas musical, adds an almost mischievous or possessive quality to the spirit. It's as if it was both aware of you and trying to make its presence known, especially during moments of joy and celebration. As for the age and energy of someone around 13, you're not alone in thinking that age might be a point where people are more open to paranormal experiences. The energy of adolescence, especially during the preteen years, can sometimes amplify sensitivity to the supernatural. Some believe that children and teenagers are more in tune with energies beyond the physical realm, possibly because they haven't yet fully developed their rational filters. Additionally, experiences like these could be related to a person's personal energy, emotions, or mental state at the time. The excitement or nervous energy of living in such an old, potentially haunted house could have, in some way, helped open a doorway for these experiences to manifest. Your story is rich with haunting details and signs that point to a lingering presence, one that seemed to interact with your family, especially through the smell, the sounds, and the physical manifestations. If the house still stands, it would be fascinating to learn whether the new owners have had similar experiences, or if those who lived there after you have been able to uncover more about its history. When my older sister was 10, my mom sent her to see a psychiatrist. Every night, she'd wake up to find a little girl standing by her bed. The girl wore an old-fashioned white dress and brown lace boots. It terrified her, and it wasn't just a one-time thing. The girl appeared every single night, and no matter where my sister moved, the girl followed. Fast forward a few years, and my sister, now 20, moved back home and brought the ghost with her. I knew when the ghost was around because both my sister and I would get this uneasy, churning feeling in our stomachs. There wasn't a single night that stands out as the scariest. The ghost was relentless, always finding ways to make me jump out of my skin. I remember standing in the shower at night, hearing strange noises coming from the air vent above. Sometimes, the water would suddenly go cold. No matter how many times I adjusted the temperature, the shower would stay freezing. The strange things didn't end there. Most nights, the family would hear the sound of a glass being taken from the cupboard, followed by the water running as if the little girl was getting a drink. Then, without fail, she would slowly open my bedroom door, just enough for the creaking to wake me up. And even though I buried myself under my blankets, drenched in sweat from sheer terror, I could feel the pressure of someone sitting at the end of my bed, close enough that I could almost feel her weight on the mattress. My sister tried to calm me, telling me, "She doesn't mean any harm, she won't hurt you." But for me, that didn't make it any easier to sleep. After night of sleeplessness and fear, I finally reached my breaking point. I couldn't go on like this anymore. I was too scared to even be alone in the house. It felt like I was never truly alone, not with her lingering around. This particular night, my sister and I had just returned from a weekend at the beach. As soon as we stepped inside, I felt that familiar wave of queasiness in my stomach. Sure enough, my mom rushed over, looking pale, and said she'd been hearing strange noises from my sister's room all weekend. The sounds were so unsettling that she had to keep the door shut the entire time. When my sister opened the door, I nearly froze in place. The sight inside was enough to make my stomach drop. Every single photograph on the walls had been torn down. All the frames were lying face down on the floor. My sister, being a collector of candles, had dozens of them in her room. But now, every single one was off its shelf and placed carefully in a circle on top of her cupboard, arranged by height. Climbing onto a chair to get a better look, I could feel the bile rising in my throat. It was like something was deliberately taunting me. That night, when the little girl sat at the end of my bed, I reached my limit. I was exhausted, terrified, and desperate for it to stop. In my mind, I just spoke to her, quietly but firmly, "You've done what you wanted. You've scared me, but I can't take it anymore. I'm really scared, please just stop." And for some reason, it worked. From that moment on, she never went out of her way to scare me again. But I had a feeling the little girl's presence had something to do with my mom's cats. I'd never been fond of them, but from that night on, I made an effort to be kinder to them. It felt like the right thing to do, and somehow, I think that's what made the difference. Eventually, my sister moved out and took the little girl and the cats with her. Now, it's my sister's boyfriend who deals with the ghost. I still give them the same advice: talk to her, don't be afraid, and be kind to the cats. This story was told to me by my aunt, and it's one that stuck with me for a long time. After a divorce, my aunt moved to a small town in New Hampshire, not far from where I lived at the time. She brought her daughter, who was only about 3 years old. They settled into a nice apartment with friendly neighbors who looked out for each other, which seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. But soon after they moved in, strange things began happening. My aunt had her own thermostat in the apartment, and every time she left, she would turn it down. But when she returned, the apartment was always unbearably hot, and the thermostat was cranked back up. At first, she thought maybe the heater was malfunctioning, so she adjusted it again and asked her neighbor across the hall if she'd seen anyone go into the apartment while she was gone. The neighbor told her that she hadn't seen anyone, but she had heard loud footsteps coming from inside. That was strange, because my aunt had the only key to the apartment. The thermostat kept doing this, and one time my aunt left the windows cracked open for some fresh air. When she came back, the windows were shut and locked tight. Once again, her neighbor said she heard footsteps inside but didn't see anyone coming or going. The weird thing seemed to settle for a while, and my aunt thought whatever was happening had stopped. But then the worst occurrences began. One day, she returned home to find her plants knocked over and her dishes shattered on the floor. She asked the neighbor if she'd heard anything, but this time, the neighbor hadn't heard a thing. The apartment was still. This unnerved my aunt, but she wasn't quite sure what to make of it. The final incident came when my aunt left my cousin alone in the apartment for a few minutes while she went down to the lobby to check the mail. She didn't lock the door when she left, but when she returned, the door was locked. She called to my cousin to unlock it, but my cousin said the door wasn't locked. Panicked, my aunt ran to her neighbor's apartment to use the phone, but the phone was out of order. In the freezing cold of winter, she had to run across the street to a payphone, barefoot. She called the fire department to request they break down the door. When she rushed back to her apartment, she checked the door again and it was still locked. By the time the fire department arrived, the door was mysteriously unlocked. They opened it, seemingly thinking my aunt was just being overly dramatic. That night, my aunt decided to try something. She lit some candles and attempted a seance, asking whoever was in her apartment to leave her and her daughter's things alone. She didn't mind if the spirit stayed, but it needed to respect her property. Surprisingly, this worked. From then on, nothing harmful happened in the apartment. The only thing that occurred after that was that, during a rainstorm, if the windows had been left open, they'd be closed by the time she returned. All in all, it seemed like whatever had been haunting her apartment had finally been appeased, and things returned to normal. She and my cousin moved out a month later, but the experience left a lasting impression on her. I've had a couple of strange experiences in my life that could be considered ghostly, though I tend to approach them with a Buddhist perspective. I don't automatically see disembodied spirits as something to fear. Instead, I think of them as transmigrating souls, part of the flow of existence. But over the years, I've also become more aware of how bizarre many of these experiences can be, as if the spirits themselves are stuck in some twisted, distorted version of reality. It's as though they're trapped in a realm where things have gone permanently wrong, and their contact with our world is often unsettling and strange. Anyway, here are the two incidents that stand out most to me. The first happened on Halloween night, sometime in the early 80s, when I was in 8th grade. My two friends and I thought it would be the perfect night for a little amateur ghost hunting. We had a portable cassette deck with a built-in microphone, and we decided to head to a local graveyard to try to capture some unexplained sounds. We figured most of the neighborhood kids would be done with their trick-or-treating by then, so the chances of hearing them on our tape would be lower. We wandered around the cemetery, and it didn't take long before we found a large headstone with several names and dates on it. At the bottom was a baby's name, along with the dates: born November 10, 1888, died October 31, 1889. That got our attention, especially since the dates were so close to Halloween. Naturally, we decided to leave the tape recorder running next to the headstone, propped up against the stone, and went off to explore for about an hour. When we returned and played back the tape, I'll never forget the feeling in the kitchen. My heart was pounding, and my friend who owned the cassette deck was the first to listen. As he put on the headphones, his expression changed from curiosity to shock, fear, and then outright horror. We all gathered around, eager and terrified, watching him as he listened. There were a few moments where we nearly jumped out of our skin when he suddenly jerked back from his chair, his face pale. We didn't find anything that could be called definitive proof of a ghost, but there was one sound that stuck with me. On the tape, faint but unmistakable, we heard the sound of a baby crying. The baby on the gravestone had been about a year old when she died, and it felt too coincidental to ignore. The second strange incident happened a couple of years later. I had just woken up from a nap, and I was watching TV in the living room. My parents weren't home, and I wasn't sure if anyone else was around. It was around 8 in the evening when I began hearing the distinct sound of my stepsister's bedroom door opening and closing. It was clear the latch would click, and the door would swing open, then shut again. This happened several times. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed she was deciding whether to leave her room or not. Then, a car pulled into the driveway, the door slammed, and suddenly my stepsister came bounding through the back door, cheerful as ever. I was a little confused. I went to her door the next day to see if I could figure out how it had happened. I checked the latch, the hinges, everything I could think of. But I never did come up with a satisfying explanation for how I'd heard her door opening and closing when she wasn't even home. Both of these incidents left me with more questions than answers. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. From the time I was born until I was about 6 or 7 years old, I lived in a house that I now believe was haunted. I was so young back then that I don't remember a lot, but there are a few experiences that my brother and I still talk about. Interestingly, my parents don't recall anything unusual happening during our time there. For me, the experiences weren't all that dramatic. There was one thing, though, that happened pretty often. On Saturday mornings, I'd wake up to the sound of dishes and silverware rattling in the kitchen, like someone was moving things around. My dad is an amazing cook, so I'd always rush in, thinking he was making breakfast. But every time I got there, the kitchen was completely empty, and my parents were still asleep in their room. I was so little that I didn't even understand what was happening. Ghosts weren't something I thought about, so I'd just turn around and go back to bed, not realizing that I should have been scared. Then there was one night I'll never forget. I was lying in bed, wide awake for some reason, and my eyes kept drifting to this little dollhouse I had, which was across from my bed. As I stared at it, something strange started to form. It looked like a little boy, sitting beside the house with one arm resting on its roof. I didn't think much of it at the time, honestly. I didn't know I should be scared. I sat up in bed and said out loud, "Do you want to play?" The boy smiled and nodded, and without hesitation, I climbed out of bed and walked toward him. But just as I got close, he vanished. I wasn't frightened at all. I just went back to bed and fell asleep, like it was nothing. Another time, my brother and I were sharing a room, and we woke up in the middle of the night to see a strange light glowing from our playhouse, which was across the room. My dad wasn't home at the time, so we called out for our mom, scared that maybe it was a burglar. She searched the entire house, checking every corner, but found nothing. Eventually, she said it must have been headlights from a passing car shining through the window. We believed her, but looking back, it seems impossible. The playhouse was in a spot where no car's lights could have reached it. But the scariest experiences happened to my older brother. At the time, I didn't know about any of them, and I didn't even realize anything strange was going on. My brother, though, still doesn't like to talk about it, so I only know what my parents told me. They said that almost every night, he would wake up crying and screaming. They'd rush to his room and find him hysterical, telling them about a mean lady sitting at the foot of his bed, smiling at him in a way that terrified him. My parents never saw anything, but they said the only way to calm him down was to take him out of the room. If they tried to bring him back in, he would start screaming again as soon as they crossed the doorway. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. For me, at that age, ghosts weren't even a thought. I didn't understand what they were or that I was supposed to be afraid of them. In fact, it wasn't until 10 years later, when my mom mentioned it, that I realized the house might have been haunted. That's when it all clicked, and I started to remember those little things I'd experienced as something more than just strange coincidences. I work at a military post in Kansas, a place steeped in history, dating back to the Civil War. The building where I work was once an old hospital, and even though it's now the post headquarters, it hasn't been renovated because of its historical significance. Over the years, there have been countless stories of hauntings here. People talk about hearing gurneys moving down the hall, and sometimes even screams echoing from different offices. But my story is a little different from those. One evening, I was staying late to work on a presentation that was due the following week. Because the building has such high security, I left only my desk lamp and computer on, hoping to avoid any run-ins with security. As I focused on my work, I started to hear the soft, high-pitched sound of a child giggling coming from the hallway. I thought maybe one of my colleagues had brought their child in with them, and they were working late as well. I needed to make some copies, so I walked down the hall toward the copy room. As I passed one of the doorways, I caught a glimpse of a little boy peeking out. He saw me and giggled. I smiled, assuming he was just playing around, and went into the copy room to get my work done. When I walked back down the hallway, I glanced over and saw the same little boy, still peeking out from the door. He was still giggling. This time, he looked up at me and asked, "Have you seen my mommy?" I stopped and looked at him, curious. "No, but who's your mommy?" I asked. "Her name is Abigail," he said, almost as if it were a secret he was sharing with me. I nodded. "Okay. If I see her, I'll let her know you're looking for her." I returned to my office to finish up the presentation. But as I worked, I caught a movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned to see the same little boy standing in my doorway, looking at me. He giggled again, then just stood there staring at me. He was dressed in old-fashioned clothes, brown wool pants, a white linen shirt, suspenders, and brown lace-up boots. It looked like something from a long time ago, not like the clothes a kid would wear today. "What are you doing here?" I asked, feeling a little unsettled. "Looking for my mommy," he replied softly. "Do you want to wait in here until she comes back?" I offered, thinking I could at least keep him company for a bit. "No, I have to keep looking," he said, and without another word, he turned and walked away down the hall. Hours later, I was getting ready to leave for the night. I decided to stop by the office where I had seen the little boy earlier. But when I looked inside, it was completely empty. No one was there. I thought maybe he and his mom had already left for the evening, so I just left the building myself. The next day, I was talking to my girlfriend, who works in the office where I had seen the boy. I asked her, "Who is Abigail?" She looked confused. "Abigail? I don't know anyone by that name." "Why?" "You sure?" I pressed. "She works in your office, doesn't she?" "No, there's no one named Abigail here," she said, sounding a bit puzzled. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Maybe I had confused her with someone else. A few weeks later, I was going through the Post's museum and stopped to look at an old photograph. It showed the same little boy, dressed in the exact same clothes I had seen him wearing. The story under the picture explained that his name was Victor Henson. He had died in a fire in the old hospital many years ago. By the time anyone could make it upstairs to save him, he was trapped. The only thing they could hear was him calling for his mommy and asking where she was. Even now, sometimes, late at night, I can still hear little Victor's giggle echoing down the hallway. A few years ago, I dated a Russian pilot named Mikhail for a short time. He'd moved to the US about 6 months before we met, and it turned out he had come here illegally, hoping to get a green card. I really enjoyed spending time with him. He was fun, charming, and smart. On weekends, we would often go to an airstrip where he knew some guys who owned planes. Mikhail would ask if we could borrow one to go flying. Now, I've always had a huge fear of flying, so I was secretly relieved when none of the guys ever let us take a plane. I think Mikhail thought he could cure my fear by taking me up, but it never happened. Still, he was always telling me that flying was statistically safer than driving, maybe even safer than walking. I'd just laugh and tell him he was crazy. As much as I liked him, the whole green card situation and some other things led to us breaking up after just a couple of months. A few months later, I heard from a mutual friend that Mikhail had gotten married and settled down. I was happy for him. Then, one Monday, I picked up the phone to hear our mutual friend say, "Did you hear what happened to Mikhail?" Apparently, he and another pilot had taken an old plane up that Saturday, and the plane crashed almost immediately. Both of them died on impact. I'm not sure when it started, but it didn't take long after I heard the news for strange things to begin happening. I'd come home from work, and the lights in my apartment would flicker on and off, no matter where I was. Then, my downstairs TV started acting up. It would turn off and wouldn't come back on. It wasn't broken, just glitching out like it had a mind of its own. I called the complex management and asked them to check the wiring. They told me it was just power surges and not to worry about it. But it didn't stop. A couple of days later, I asked my neighbor if she was having the same issues. She wasn't. I told her about Mikhail, half joking, and asked if she thought I might have some unexpected company. She paused for a moment and then said, well, he was 36, newlywed, had everything to live for, and died completely unexpectedly. He wasn't ready to go. The lights and TV glitches continued. So, in a bit of a panic, I called the cable company, thinking maybe if they fixed my cable, the TV might start working again. But the strangest thing happened one night. I woke up in the middle of the night, and both the upstairs TV and an oscillating fan by my bed were turning themselves on and off. I got up, unplugged both the TV and the fan, and went back to sleep. I swear, I even muttered, knock it off, Misha. Everything kept happening for a few more days until, finally, that Monday morning, the cable guy came to fix both of my TVs. It was around 10 a.m. when he finished, and after that, the weird electrical issues stopped completely. Was it just a coincidence that Mikhail's funeral was also at 10 a.m. that Monday morning? His family had to travel from Russia, which is why the delay. And if Mikhail was really trying to contact me, why didn't he haunt his wife? I don't know. Maybe he did, but it just seemed like he was drawn to me. A little over a year ago, my 25-year-old son took his own life. As you can imagine, it has been absolutely devastating for our entire family. We're still struggling to understand why he did it. He was always such a fun, warm-hearted person. His problems didn't seem any worse than anyone else's, and he always handled tough situations better than most. We miss him so much, and we often wish we could know for certain that he continues on in some way, somewhere, and that he's okay now. We still love him, he'll always be family, and we try our best to hold on to forgiving thoughts toward him. A few weeks ago, my husband, a friend of ours, and I decided to take a day trip to Ojai, a nearby town known for its charming restaurants, interesting stores, and art galleries. It was around 3 p.m., broad daylight, and we were walking down the main street, on our way to a late lunch. Our friend had just cracked a hilarious joke, and all three of us were laughing hard. As I glanced across the street, I noticed our reflection in the windows of a darkened store across from us. But there was something strange about the reflection. It wasn't just the three of us. There was a fourth figure walking with us. I looked closer. It was my son. He was walking with his signature long-legged stride, throwing his head back and laughing, exactly like he used to do. He was just there. In the reflection, walking with us, laughing, and part of our conversation, like he had always been. The reflection was in full color, or at least, the muted color you get in any darkened glass, but something about it was different. It felt more vibrant, more alive. I tried to get my husband's attention to show him, but I suddenly found myself unable to speak. I was just flapping my hand, trying to clear my throat for a few moments. The reflection itself looked odd. While the three of us were reflected normally, my son's image seemed to shimmer, as though it was reflected on water instead of glass. His image was slightly rippled, almost as if sunlight was glinting off the surface of a pond, with little sparkles of light flickering through his reflection. I wasn't frightened, but I'll admit, all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It wasn't scary, though, if anything, it was comforting. It was like seeing him again, happy and laughing, just taking a walk with us on a sunny afternoon. I blinked a few times, trying to process what I was seeing, and when I opened my eyes again, he was gone. The whole thing lasted maybe 6 seconds. I debated whether to tell my husband and our friend about what I had seen. I decided to wait a few days, and eventually, I told my husband. He was surprisingly open-minded about it, saying that he sometimes feels like he sees him out of the corner of his eye, or even speaks to him in dreams. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, grief clouding my thoughts, and my longing to see my son again manifesting in some way. Or maybe, just maybe, he really was there with us. I like to think it was him. In any case, it was a comforting experience. It was a reminder that not all ghosts are haunting, and not all spirits of those who pass in tragic ways are lost in darkness. Some, like my son, might just be out there, quietly walking beside us, offering a moment of peace. When I was younger, I lived in a foster home in a city about an hour from my hometown. I was around 8 years old, and being away from my parents for the first time was really hard. My foster mother did everything she could to make me feel at home, and we spent a lot of time doing things around the house that she hoped would help me settle in. One afternoon, we went up to the attic to go through some old photo albums and boxes of things that had been packed away. The house was only one story, with an attic, and the only way to get up there was by using a pull-down ladder from the ceiling. We had left the ladder out so we could hear if someone rang the doorbell. We were sitting on the dusty floor, surrounded by old albums and forgotten keepsakes, when I started to get this strange feeling. It was as though we weren't alone up there. I didn't mention it at first, thinking maybe I was just imagining things. But just as I was about to say something, the door to the attic, along with the stairs, slammed shut with a loud bang. Both of us froze, staring at the door. After a moment, my foster mother chuckled and tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just the wind or something. She got up to put the ladder back down, but after pushing for a while, she came back and said that something must have bumped the latch and locked it. I wasn't so sure. It didn't seem possible for the door to just shut like that, but for the latch to actually lock? That didn't make sense to me at all. My foster mother tried to calm me down. "Everything's fine," she said. "When your foster dad gets home, he'll let us out." So, we sat there for a while, trying to go back to looking at pictures and forget about being locked in. Then, just as we were getting settled, the window at the far end of the attic flew open. It was midwinter, so the wind was strong, and it blew several shoe boxes with old photos onto their sides. The pictures scattered across the floor. My foster mother hurried over and shut the window, mumbling that she could have sworn it was locked. Again, she shrugged it off as the wind and we began picking up the pictures. By now, I was certain something wasn't right. This couldn't just be the wind. I tried to tell my foster mother, but she insisted there were no such things as ghosts. As soon as those words left her mouth, a small vanity mirror on a desk a few feet away shattered with a deafening crash. The sound that followed was horrible, like the screech of car brakes being slammed down hard. The noise echoed through the room, and I screamed in terror. My foster mother grabbed my hand and rushed toward the ladder. As we reached it, the door to the attic suddenly flew open, and my foster father appeared at the top, clambering up to us. My foster mother and I nearly pushed him back down the ladder in our haste to get out. We scrambled down the stairs and into the living room, breathless and shaken. My foster father said he had come through the door, heard the crash, and my scream, and had realized where we were. But he said he hadn't heard the strange screeching sound until he was actually in the attic with us. We couldn't figure that out. The noise had been so loud, surely it should have carried outside the attic, too. After that, I was too scared to ever go back up into the attic. For the 3 years I lived there, my foster father always had to go up and get the Christmas decorations or anything else that was stored up there. I never went near the stairs again. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. When I was around 10 years old, I lived with my aunt, uncle, and 3 cousins in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Renton, Washington. Our house sat near the edge of a wooded area, a patch of trees and underbrush that we, the kids, would explore almost every day. The woods became our secret refuge, a place where we could escape the hustle and bustle of home life, build forts, and sometimes just sit under the trees and talk. Karen, my cousin, was my best friend. We were inseparable, always together, especially after school when we'd dash out to the woods without a second thought. On most days, Karen would grab me and say, "Come on, let's go to the woods." And, of course, I would follow. We'd head down the trail together, chatting, laughing, and sometimes getting lost in our own world. But one day, something happened that neither of us could explain, something we'd talk about for years to come. It started when we were walking down the familiar path, heading deeper into the woods. Without warning, Karen stopped dead in her tracks and grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. I looked around, confused. "Hear what?" "It sounded like a woman, calling us," she said, her eyes wide with concern. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight. "Well, maybe it's your mom?" I suggested, though I wasn't sure why I even said that her mom wasn't home. "No," Karen shook her head, "she's not even home yet, and that didn't sound like her." Now, I was starting to get a little freaked out. "Karen, you're freaking me out." "Stop it," I said, trying to brush it off. But she wasn't convinced. "I'm serious." "Didn't you hear it?" she insisted. But I didn't hear anything. I shrugged it off as a trick of the wind, though I could tell Karen wasn't convinced. We pressed on, though Karen didn't let go of my arm. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. Whatever it was she'd heard, it was clearly unsettling her. We made our way to our special spot in the woods, the old maple tree. It had been our secret place for as long as I could remember. We'd play on the rope swing there, talk about everything and nothing, and just escape into our own world. That tree was our refuge. We'd even carved our names into the bark, marking our territory as if the tree itself belonged to us. That day, we swung on the rope, laughing, letting the cool air rush past our faces. But when it was Karen's turn, everything changed. As she swung high into the air, a scream tore from her throat. I turned, my heart in my throat, and ran over to her. "What's wrong?" I gasped. "Look," she pointed toward the bushes, her face pale as a ghost. I followed her finger and felt my breath catch in my chest. In the distance, standing just beyond the trees, was a woman. She was dressed in a long blue dress, the fabric flowing eerily in the breeze. But it wasn't the dress that made my heart race, it was her skin. Her skin was glowing white, like she was illuminated from within, and her face was obscured by the shadows of her hood. She stood completely still, her finger pointed directly at us. I couldn't move. Fear rooted me to the spot. My legs felt like jelly, and my vision blurred as I clung to Karen, who was trembling beside me. The woman didn't move at first, just pointed at us with a long, thin finger. Then, slowly, she started walking toward us. Her hand reached out, and that was when panic hit. Karen screamed, and in that moment, we both found our feet, running as fast as we could without looking back. We didn't stop until we were out of the woods, breathless and terrified, not daring to look over our shoulders. 4 months afterward, Karen and I talked about the Blue Lady, as we came to call her, and we never went near that old maple tree again. Whenever we'd pass by the woods, we'd hurry, glancing over at the darkening trees with a shiver running down our spines. To this day, Karen and I still talk about it, sometimes laughing nervously, sometimes wondering if we had both imagined it. But deep down, we know what we saw. That woman, with her glowing skin and haunting presence, was real. And we were never the same after that day in the woods. In the early to mid-80s, my family moved into a townhouse in Hialeah, Florida, a modern city with its own share of charm. The townhouse had 3 floors, and most of the strange things that happened were on the second and third floors. My room was on the second floor, while my playroom was on the third. I was just a young child, about 5 or 6 years old, and I started to experience something that I can't quite explain. I would talk to what I now believe was a spirit. At first, I wasn't frightened, and I had what felt like a strange, unspoken communication with it. I remember this spirit being a tall, blonde woman. A lot of the conversations we had are lost to me now, but I do remember a sense of familiarity, like she wasn't a stranger. Things took a turn when my older brother and his girlfriend brought a Ouija board into the house. I was terrified of it and never went near it or even stayed in the room while they played. But once that board was introduced, everything changed. The atmosphere in the house shifted. I stopped going into my playroom altogether. It felt like something was watching me, and the fear started to grow. The room, despite being on the top floor, always felt cold even during the warmest summers. It had a small balcony, and yet, no matter how hot it was outside, the air inside felt chilling. This was also the same room where my brother and his girlfriend had used the Ouija board. At night, strange things began happening. We would hear muffled voices, sounds of furniture moving, and heavy footsteps coming from that room. It felt as though something, or someone, was still there, lingering. Electrical devices started acting up too. My ceiling fan would turn on by itself, and my radio would randomly switch stations, as though something was manipulating them. I became too afraid to sleep alone, so I started staying with my parents. The fear wasn't just in my room, it seemed to spread throughout the house. Over time, it felt like the house itself brought a sense of bad luck. My father's once thriving business began to fail, we found ourselves getting sick more often than usual, and everyone's mood seemed to change. Later on, I found out something that explained a lot. The original owner of the townhouse had been a santero, someone involved in witchcraft and spiritual practices. It made me wonder if the house had absorbed some of that energy, or if it had left behind something darker. Strangely, most of the families that had lived there before us experienced similar misfortunes, although I don't know if they had the same encounters with spirits or noises. Even now, my family and I still have nightmares about that townhouse. In the dreams, we always end up trapped, unable to escape, and the feelings of dread linger long after we wake up. My family doesn't talk about those experiences, they avoid it altogether. I don't know how it was for them, but for me, the memories of that house, of what we felt and heard, still haunt me. And I wonder if we'll ever be able to forget. One evening, my sister and I were sitting around, trying to scare each other with ghost stories, as kids do. We were having a lot of fun until, to our surprise, my dad, who's always been very practical and down-to-earth, said he had experienced something strange himself. He told us that this happened when he was very young, back in the early part of the century. At that time, he lived in a small, rural town in Texas. The communities were scattered far apart, and the roads were narrow, often deserted, especially at night. My grandfather used to take my father on trips into town to visit the city jail, mostly as a kind of lesson in what could happen if you broke the law. They'd meet various characters there, mostly harmless drunks or people who had gotten into minor trouble. One day, though, they found a familiar face behind bars. It was my father's uncle, Sam. He had just been arrested for murder. Apparently, Uncle Sam had gotten into a heated argument with an acquaintance after losing a poker game. Both men were drunk, and Uncle Sam thought he'd been cheated. Angry and desperate to get his money back, he laid in wait for the other man on a deserted road. When the man approached, Uncle Sam ambushed him, and they struggled. In the end, he killed the man. But the story took an even darker turn. In his rage, Uncle Sam severed the man's head before fleeing the scene. The next day, overcome with guilt, Uncle Sam confessed to the crime. The police went to search for the body, but they couldn't find the head. After hours of searching, they discovered that buzzards had dragged it away several yards from where the body had been left. Uncle Sam, visibly shaken, started screaming in his cell, claiming that the ghost of the man he had killed was haunting him. He said the ghost wanted to be set free. A day or two later, my father learned that Uncle Sam had hung himself in his jail cell. That wasn't the part that frightened him, though. What happened next still sends chills down his spine to this day. A few weeks later, my father and grandfather made their usual trip into town to pick up supplies for the farm. It was late at night when they began their journey back home, and they were both tired from the long day. At the time, most people still traveled by wagon, so even a short trip took hours. The road they traveled was the same one where Uncle Sam had killed the man, and it was pitch dark, with only the faint light from a lantern my father held. As they were making their way down the road, my father saw something that made his blood run cold. A vague, white apparition seemed to float out from the brush beside the road. It passed right under the horses pulling the wagon. The horses immediately grew agitated, moving nervously back and forth. My father's heart raced as he watched the figure float calmly across the road and disappear into the night. In a matter of seconds, it was gone, and the horses slowly calmed down. My grandfather, who had been focused on controlling the horses, didn't seem to think much of it. He brushed it off as the shadow of a small animal. But later, when they went back to town and visited the jail again, my grandfather told the story to one of the policemen. The officer seemed stunned and asked where exactly this strange event had occurred. When my grandfather described the spot, the officer went silent for a moment before telling him that it was the very place where the police had found the victim's head. It was a chilling coincidence, or perhaps something more. My father often wondered if what they saw that night was the ghost of the man Uncle Sam had killed, still wandering the very road where he met his end. The whole experience left my father with a sense of unease that stayed with him for years. After leaving the military, I moved back to my hometown of Placerville, California, to stay with some friends. Placerville is an old mining town, rich in history, and I found myself living in one of its most historic houses. This old house on Pleasant Street was a landmark, even listed in the town's official tour guide. Strange occurrences were known to happen there, but for the most part, I found them fascinating rather than frightening. The house had an intriguing backstory. It was originally built as an inn for stagecoach travelers passing through Placerville. Behind the inn stood an old schoolhouse on a hill. Legend has it that the schoolmaster, in a fit of madness, locked the children inside the schoolhouse and set it on fire. The tragic event left only the surviving wood, which, years later, was used to build the second story of the house on Pleasant Street. It's said that the spirits of the children who perished in that fire haunt the attic, which was built with the very wood from the burned-down schoolhouse. As the anniversary of their deaths neared, strange activity in the house would always intensify. The house had a reputation for unsettling experiences. Previous tenants had left, frightened by what they encountered. There were rumors of an old superstition: if a family moved in with children, the parents were advised to be gentle with them. One man who had raised a hand to his child had nearly been killed by a falling chandelier, an incident that began when he watched, horrified, as the screws holding it in place fell out, one by one, for no apparent reason. I had the privilege, if you can call it that, of living in a room on the second floor. The door to the attic was right in my bedroom, and it was often when I was alone that I would sense a presence. It was never threatening, just inquisitive, like a curious child watching me from a distance, unsure whether to approach. The sensation was always oddly calming, as though the spirits were as intrigued by me as I was by them. Two women who lived in the house before me had their own experiences. Val, who lived on the second floor, refused to go up the narrow, cramped stairs without feeling uneasy. She said that just being near the stairs made her uncomfortable, and she often felt like something was moving up there when the second floor was unoccupied. Another woman, living on the first floor, avoided the basement completely because of the overwhelming sense of terror she felt whenever she went down there. She, too, claimed to hear unexplained sounds coming from upstairs when no one was there. One afternoon, just before Halloween, I had a vivid encounter with the spirits. I was alone in the house, and it was a still, calm day. I was napping when I was suddenly jolted awake by the sound of the porch door swinging open, followed by it slamming shut. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of a child's footsteps running across the floor in the living room. The footsteps paused at the stairwell, and for a moment, I thought Val and her kids had returned early. But then I remembered they were all out of town. The footsteps resumed, slowly making their way up the stairs. When they reached the top, the noise stopped. I cautiously got out of bed, opened my bedroom door, and looked out into the hallway. Nothing. The air was slightly chilly, but otherwise, there was no sign of anyone. I closed the door and went back to bed. That's when I felt a faint breeze, as though it were coming from the attic, flowing through the room. It was as though the spirit had just been observing me, curious and gentle. Another memorable experience happened on Halloween Eve. Feeling in the mood for a ghostly encounter, I decided to try something different. I turned off all the lights, lit a few candles, and began to meditate, hoping to invite the spirits of the children to come out of the attic. I practiced relaxation techniques to open myself up to contact. After about 20 minutes, the atmosphere in the room began to change. Though the windows and doors were closed, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably, and a light breeze started to circulate around me. I felt the presence of small children, playful and inquisitive, just as I had imagined. For a while, I simply sat there, sensing their presence, not frightened but calm and curious, as though they were studying me as much as I was studying them. After some time, I thanked them for their visit and blew out the candles, turning the lights back on. Even after the session ended, I could still feel their presence for another 5 or 10 minutes, lingering in the room, as if they weren't quite ready to leave. Those experiences in the old house on Pleasant Street were some of the strangest and most intriguing moments of my life. I never felt threatened by the spirits, but rather, I felt a kind of connection, a sense that they were just curious children, as fascinated by me as I was by them. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. When I was around 8 years old, I lived in a foster home in a city about an hour away from my hometown. Being away from my parents for the first time was incredibly difficult, but my foster mother did everything she could to make me feel at home. We spent a lot of time together, and she always tried to include me in various tasks around the house to help me settle in. One afternoon, we were up in the attic, going through old photo albums and boxes of forgotten belongings. The house itself was only one story with an attic above, and the only way to reach it was via a pull-down ladder in the ceiling. We had left the ladder down so we could hear if anyone rang the doorbell, and we were sitting on the dusty floor surrounded by old clothes and faded photos. My foster mother was telling me stories about the people in the pictures, sharing bits of their lives and history, when I suddenly had the strangest feeling that we weren't alone. I turned to mention it to her, but before I could speak, there was a loud bang. The door and ladder to the attic slammed shut on their own. My foster mother and I both froze for a moment, staring at the now closed door. She let out a nervous laugh and tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just the wind. She stood up to open the ladder again, but when she tried, it wouldn't budge. She pushed for several minutes before sitting back down, claiming that the latch must have somehow gotten bumped into place. But I was skeptical. The door had shut on its own, and the latch had locked. I couldn't believe that was just a coincidence. She tried to keep me calm, assuring me that everything was fine and that when my foster father came home, he would let us out. We tried to go back to looking at the pictures, though I couldn't shake the unsettling feeling. But then, something even stranger happened. The window at the far end of the room flew open with a bang. It was midwinter, and the wind was strong. It blew several shoe boxes with loose pictures out of place, sending them scattering across the floor. My foster mother quickly rushed over to close the window, muttering that she could have sworn it was locked. Again, she dismissed it as just the wind, and we set about picking up the pictures. At this point, I was convinced that this was no ordinary wind. I tried to tell my foster mother that something wasn't right, but she brushed me off, insisting there were no such things as ghosts. The moment she said that, a small vanity mirror on a desk a few feet away suddenly shattered with a loud crash. The noise that followed was like a horrible screech, almost like the sound of car brakes being slammed. It was so loud and piercing that I screamed, and my foster mother grabbed my hand, rushing toward the stairs. Just as we were about to reach the ladder, the attic door suddenly flew open. My foster father came clambering up into the attic, clearly startled by the crash and my scream. My foster mother and I nearly pushed him back down, and we quickly climbed down ourselves, terrified. Once we were safely on the floor below, my foster mother slammed and latched the attic door shut. We rushed into the living room, both of us shaken and out of breath. My foster father explained that he had heard the crash and my scream when he came in the door, and he had realized where we were. He said he hadn't heard the strange screeching sound until he actually entered the attic. That confused all of us because the noise had been so loud, surely it would have carried down into the house. I was terrified. For the next 3 years that I lived there, I never went back into that attic. My foster father always had to go up and get the Christmas decorations or the summer playthings for outside. I couldn't shake the feeling that something in that attic didn't want us up there. After I left the military, I moved back to my hometown of Placerville, California, and lived with some friends in an old house. Placerville is a historic mining town with a rich past, and the house I moved into was a well-known historical landmark. It was even listed in the town's tour guide, and as you might expect, strange occurrences were often associated with it. Despite the unsettling history, I wasn't bothered by these events. In fact, I found them oddly fascinating. The house on Pleasant Street had an interesting and chilling story. Originally, it served as an inn for stagecoach travelers passing through Placerville. Behind the house, there was once an old schoolhouse on a hill. The history says that the schoolmaster went mad one day and locked the children inside, setting the schoolhouse on fire. When the fire was finally put out, most of the building had been destroyed, but some of the wood survived. Years later, that wood was used to build the second story of the house on Pleasant Street. Legend has it that the spirits of the children who perished in that fire still haunt the attic, as the second story and attic were constructed with the very wood from the burned schoolhouse. According to local lore, spirit activity intensifies as the anniversary of the fire approaches, and based on my experiences, that's no exaggeration. Past residents of the house have left in fear, disturbed by the strange occurrences they couldn't explain. One of the most chilling stories was of a man who raised his hand to discipline one of his children. Shortly afterward, a chandelier fell from the ceiling, though before it fell, the screws mysteriously unscrewed themselves one by one. People who moved into the house with children quickly learned to treat them kindly, or else they might pay the price for their harshness. I had the privilege of living in a room on the second floor, which just so happened to have the door to the attic in it. Often, I would feel like I wasn't alone, as though there was a curious presence watching me. It wasn't threatening, but more like the feeling you get when a child is watching you with wide eyes, eager to learn what you're doing. I never felt afraid, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was always nearby. One of the women who had lived there before, Val, told me she couldn't bring herself to go up the narrow stairwell to the second floor. Just being on the stairs made her feel uneasy. Another woman, who lived on the first floor, refused to go into the basement because it filled her with terror. Both women admitted that they often heard noises coming from the second floor when no one was up there, things moving around, footsteps, and strange creaks. One day, a little before Halloween, I had a vivid encounter. I was the only one at home, and it was an unusually still day. There wasn't a breath of wind. I had been napping in my room when I suddenly awoke to the sound of the porch door slamming open, followed by it slamming shut again. Then, I heard the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps running across the living room floor. When the footsteps reached the foot of the stairs, they stopped. For a moment, I thought it was Val and her kids returning home, but then I remembered that they had gone out of town for the day. The footsteps resumed, this time slowly ascending the staircase. When they reached the top, the sound stopped. I got up from my bed, walked over to my door, and opened it. There was nothing there. The stairwell was slightly chilly, but other than that, the house was quiet. I closed the door and returned to my bed, only to feel a light breeze flow across the room, heading toward the attic door in the corner. Then came Halloween Eve, and I decided to try something a bit daring. I was in the mood for a ghostly encounter, so I turned off the lights, lit a few candles, and set the atmosphere for something more spiritual. I was determined to invite the spirits of the children to visit. Sitting comfortably in a chair, I began to meditate, using a few relaxation exercises to open myself up for contact. After about 20 minutes, I began to feel a distinct presence in the room, small, inquisitive, childlike. Though both the door and the window were closed, the temperature in the room dropped, and I felt a slight breeze circulating. I wasn't scared, though. Instead, I felt a kind of mutual curiosity, as though the spirits were just as intrigued by me as I was by them. The presence lingered for a while, but after some time, I thanked the spirits for their visit. I turned on the lights, blew out the candles, and ended the session. However, even after I had finished, the energy in the room remained strong for another 5 or 10 minutes, as if the spirits weren't quite ready to leave. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. When I was younger, my mom would occasionally tell me a story from her childhood in the late 1940s, a story that never failed to send chills down my spine. She grew up in Germany, living in a small apartment with her parents and 2 older sisters. The girls shared a bedroom in the attic, a place that, for all its quiet seclusion, would become the scene of something far from peaceful. My mom would often wake in the middle of the night, feeling an eerie sense of dread. The light shining in her face always signaled the same thing, the visitation of a dark figure, a monk-like apparition wearing a robe and a hood. Its face was always hidden in shadow, but she could feel its presence clearly. The figure would approach her bed, and she could hear its low, deliberate footsteps ascending the attic stairs, one creak after another, growing closer with each passing moment. Frozen with terror, my mom could never move. It was as though some unseen force kept her pinned to her bed, unable to escape, as the figure would loom over her and place its hands around her neck. It would attempt to strangle her, though she could never fully explain what it was trying to do. The sensation was suffocating, paralyzing, and utterly terrifying, but she could do nothing but lie there, helplessly waiting for it to finish. One night, in an attempt to escape its grasp, she ducked under the covers to the foot of the bed, hoping the figure wouldn't find her. But it did. To her horror, the monk-like figure simply reached under the covers and lifted them from the other end of the bed. It knew exactly where she was hiding. My mom tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her sisters, oblivious to what was happening, slept soundly beside her. She couldn't tell her parents, either, for fear of being punished for what they would likely dismiss as silly stories, especially given the strictness of my grandparents. The visits occurred sporadically, but always with the same terrifying pattern. She'd wake up to the light, hear the footsteps, and know it was time for the same nightmare to repeat. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the family moved away, and the terrifying visits stopped. Even now, decades later, my mom is reluctant to speak about it. The memory still unsettles her, and though she's considered seeing a hypnotist to explore whether it was all just a figment of her imagination, there's a fear that if she does, the figure might somehow return. As disturbing as her experience was, it's one of the few first-hand accounts of the supernatural I've ever heard. And while I've heard other stories, like that of my sister's friend in New Milford, Connecticut, who sometimes hears ghostly baby cries coming from a hole in her fireplace, it's my mom's story that always lingers with me. There's something about the relentless nature of her tormentor, the monk-like figure, that feels so unnervingly real, even decades later. My cat Henry was my best friend. We got him when I was in my first year of high school, and from that point on, we grew up together. Henry was a big, laid-back cat, and he had this way of quietly matching my temperament. We understood each other in a way that only those closest can. One of Henry's quirks was coming into my room late at night to sleep on my bed. He was a large cat, and when he jumped onto the bed, I always felt it, the weight of his body settling against the back of my legs. It was a comforting feeling, and even though it woke me up every time, I never minded. Then one evening, after a long day at work, I came home and noticed that Henry didn't come to visit. I thought it was odd, but I didn't think much more about it. I was exhausted, and the last thing on my mind was my cat not showing up. But as the evening went on, I heard a strange, unsettling growl from outside. I went to the door and rushed out to find 3 neighborhood dogs attacking Henry. I screamed for them to stop, and I chased them away, but by the time I got to Henry, it was too late. He died in my arms about an hour later. I was devastated. I'd never known a love quite like what I had with that cat. It was a raw, aching grief, and I couldn't bring myself to believe he was really gone. My dad buried him in the yard, but the house felt emptier without him. Weeks passed, but the loss still weighed heavily on me. One night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Henry and how much I missed him. Then, in the quiet of the night, I heard the unmistakable sound of claws clicking softly against the old wooden floors of our house. It was the same sound Henry made when he walked around, the familiar rhythm of his paws. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, I froze, afraid to move or breathe. But then, I felt something jump onto the bed, settling on the back of my legs exactly where Henry used to lay. It felt real. The weight of him was there, solid and comforting. I couldn't explain it, but I wasn't scared. I felt comforted. I drifted off to sleep, almost in a trance, and when I woke up, the weight was gone. Several days later, I remembered what had happened. The memory of that night hit me all at once, and I couldn't help but wonder, had I just imagined it? Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a way to cope with the grief. But deep down, I like to believe that it was really Henry, that he was still there with me, comforting me in the only way he knew how, by being there when I needed him most. Even now, when I think back on it, I can't explain it logically, but in my heart, I know that Henry was there, even after he had passed. I like to think that, somehow, he came back to me that night to offer a final bit of comfort. They say dead men tell no tales, but doesn't that mean they shouldn't breathe either? My story takes place about 10 years ago when I was 14. My family lived in a large old house in London, England, one of those places with high ceilings, creaky floorboards, and an almost perpetual chill in the air. It was the kind of house where you could hear whispers in the walls and feel eyes on you, even when no one was around. I lived there with my parents, my 2 sisters, and my 2-year-old niece, Amy. One night, my older sister Debbie, Amy, and I were the only ones home. It was bedtime for Amy, so Debbie took her upstairs to get her settled in her crib. I stayed downstairs, watching TV, trying to relax after a long day. About half an hour later, I heard Debbie's voice calling me from upstairs. She didn't sound frantic, but there was something in her tone that made me uneasy. "Can you come up here?" she called. I was a little irritated. "Why?" I shouted back. "Just come up here," she insisted. So, feeling somewhat disgruntled, I trudged up the stairs and into Amy's room. As I walked in, I saw Amy sitting wide awake in her crib, her big, innocent eyes fixed on me. She looked perfectly fine, so I was confused as to why Debbie had called me. "Listen," Debbie said, her voice low and shaky. I turned my attention to the room, trying to make sense of what was going on. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so soft I thought it might be my imagination, but then it became clearer. There was a quiet, rhythmic breathing coming from somewhere in the room. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I leaned into Amy's crib, listening to the rise and fall of her little chest, trying to match it with the sound I was hearing. But it wasn't her. I froze, my heart suddenly racing. I looked up at Debbie, who was pale, her eyes wide with fear. I must have looked just as frightened, because neither of us said a word, but I could tell she knew. She had heard it too. The breathing became faster and faster, almost frantic, until it stopped abruptly. The room felt heavy and suffocating. Without thinking, I scooped Amy up out of her crib and, with Debbie following close behind, I hurried downstairs as fast as I could. We didn't stop until we were back in the living room, sitting together in silence, our nerves on edge. Neither of us said anything more about what happened, though we both knew what we had experienced. That night, we stayed in the living room, even when our parents came home. We didn't tell them about the strange breathing. There was an unspoken agreement between Debbie and me not to bring it up. Eventually, Amy fell asleep, but neither of us could shake the unease that lingered in the air. The next day, I convinced myself that maybe it had been old pipes in the walls or the roof making strange noises. I decided to check for myself. I climbed up into the loft, determined to find a logical explanation. The space above Amy's room was dark, cramped, and filled with cobwebs. I moved slowly through the shadows, searching every corner for anything that could explain what had happened. But there was nothing. Nothing except the silence. It happened 32 years ago when I was 16, and my family had just moved to a new home on Cherry Street in Mesa, Arizona. Our new house was an old adobe-style building, probably built in the 1920s. The move was exhausting, and after all the furniture had been unloaded, I was glad to finally have my own room with an outside door no less, which felt like a ticket to freedom. But that first night, I wasn't going anywhere. I was too tired from all the work, and I fell asleep almost immediately. Later that evening, something woke me up. At first, I thought it was a bug. It felt like something crawling on my skin, light and quick, like tiny spider legs. I began swatting at it, brushing it off my body, but it seemed to follow me, tickling every inch of my skin as it moved over me. It was an unnerving sensation. After slapping at myself repeatedly, the feeling stopped, and I opened my eyes to check the clock. It was exactly 12 o'clock, midnight. That's when I felt it. My head turned on its own, as though controlled by something unseen. My eyes were drawn to the hallway, and I knew there was something there. Something moving. But there was nothing visible, only the presence of a being moving slowly toward me. My eyes followed it as it approached the foot of my bed. Then, another presence appeared in the hallway, moving toward me, and came to rest beside the first. It happened 5 times, each time another unseen being drawing close to my bed until the space around me felt full of them. Then came a loud thump. It sounded like a fist pounding on the outside door to my room. Terrified, I jumped up without thinking and flung the door open, but when I stepped into the hallway, there was nothing, no one at the door, not even a stone or anything that might have caused the noise. I spent the rest of the night in my brother's room, trying to sleep on 2 chairs, my mind racing, unsure of what had just happened. Was it all a trick of my tired mind? Maybe the crawling sensation had been nerves, or maybe it had been the house settling. Perhaps I had imagined the knocking, the presence of unseen figures around my bed. I wanted to believe it was nothing more than my imagination playing tricks on me. But then something happened the next morning that made me question everything. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Wayne, my friend who lived across the street, showed up for breakfast. Without me saying a word, he started telling me his own strange experience from the night before. He lived in a house with an elderly lady who rented him a room. Just like me, he'd woken up in the middle of the night, feeling something crawling on him. He described the exact same sensation I'd felt, something tickling its way over his body. And just like me, he heard a loud crash on his door. He jumped up and opened it, and at the same time, his landlady opened hers. They were both startled, but she didn't seem surprised. She just calmly told him, sometimes, odd things happen on Cherry Street. She went on to tell him that one night, she'd seen the doorknob to the front door turning back and forth, as if someone were trying to get in. But when she looked outside, there was no one there. The doorknob just kept turning. I was stunned when Wayne told me his story. What struck me was that he described exactly what I had experienced, right down to the crawling sensation and the knock at the door. I was glad he told me his version first, because if I had told him mine, and he'd said, "Oh yeah, that happened to me too," I would have been more skeptical. But since his memory of the event had faded over time while mine had remained so vivid, it made me wonder if maybe there was something to all of this. To this day, I'm not sure what happened in that house on Cherry Street. Maybe it was all just coincidence, or maybe it was something we couldn't explain. But the memories of those nights have stayed with me all these years. I don't know if it means anything, but it seems clear to me now that Cherry Street had, or maybe still has, its ghosts. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. In the fall of 1996, my father and brother purchased a small-town hotel, and that's where my story begins. One evening, my mother and I were upstairs, changing the sheets in some of the rooms. It was a typical evening, but as I worked, I began to experience something I couldn't explain. The hotel, though charming, had a history of whispers about strange happenings. Locals were quick to tell us it was haunted, sharing stories about past owners who'd had their own eerie experiences. We didn't take these tales seriously, even though they were unsettling. And, I'll admit, I'd taken to bringing my radio upstairs when I was alone, just to make the atmosphere feel less oppressive. On this particular evening, I had finished cleaning and vacuuming room number 4 and was about to move on to room number 5 when I realized I had left my dusting rag in one of the previous rooms. I went back to look for it and found it in room number 3, but that wasn't all I found. The bed, which I had just made, was a mess. The sheets were crumpled in a ball in the middle of the mattress, as if someone had been jumping on it. At first, I thought my mother had returned, not realizing I'd already changed the bed in that room, so I went into the hallway and called out, "Mom, I just finished room number 3. The sheets are already changed." No response. I figured I must have been mistaken and decided to remake the bed. But as I was finishing, I had a strange feeling. I double-checked the other rooms and went downstairs, but before leaving for the evening, I decided to do a final sweep of the upstairs. I made my way back to room number 3, and what I found stopped me cold. The bed was once again a mess. The pillows were scattered across the room, as though someone had thrown them. A surge of anger washed over me. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I snapped, but as soon as the words left my mouth, I felt utterly foolish. Who was I talking to? Mom was downstairs, and there was no one else in the hotel. I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was the heating vent or something else causing the disturbance. But the heating vent was on the opposite side of the room, far from the bed. I couldn't explain it, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I needed to get downstairs and away from whatever this was. I turned off the lights, grabbed my cleaning supplies, and rushed down the stairs, leaving room number 3 in disarray. Later, as we were preparing to leave, my mom discovered I'd left the dirty sheets and cleaning supplies upstairs. She insisted I go back up and gather everything. By then, the fear that had been gnawing at me earlier had grown. I turned on every light as I climbed the stairs, adrenaline pumping through my body. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, but I told myself it was all in my head. At the top of the staircase, I looked down the dark hallway toward the 8 rooms. They all stood still, just as I had left them. But when I reached room number 3, something caught my eye. The bed was freshly made, with the sheets neatly smoothed over the mattress. I hadn't gone back into that room to remake the bed. I knew for sure that my mother hadn't either. She'd been downstairs with me the whole time. My father was out of town for work, and my brother wasn't home. So, who had made the bed? To this day, I can't explain what happened that night. I know it wasn't a mistake or a simple mishap. The sheets weren't just disturbed, they had been rearranged in a way that felt intentional, as if someone had been in the room, moving things around. Since that night, nothing like that has ever happened again, not to me, my mother, or anyone else I know who's stayed in the hotel. But I can't forget that feeling, the overwhelming sense of being watched, or the inexplicable way the bed was made up in room number 3. Now, whenever I go upstairs to help my mother change beds, I make sure to steer clear of room number 3. There's something in there, something I can't quite understand, and I'm not in any rush to find out more. First, the town was originally called Wolf Hill, named by Daniel Boone in the late 1700s. It became Abington in 1832, not 100 years ago, as she suggested. Second, while we do have over 100 historic buildings from the 17th and 18th centuries, there are not 100 haunted places in Abington. There are certainly ghosts here, but nowhere near that many. Lastly, Martha Washington College opened in 1860, and the Civil War started in 1861, hardly many years apart, as she described. But the biggest issue was with the story of the singing ghost. I've never heard of this ghost, and neither have the people I asked. The story she seems to be referring to was about a girl named Beth, a student at the school during the Civil War. Beth did fall in love with an injured soldier, and he did die, but she was a violinist, not a singer. She played music for him, not singing. And contrary to what was said, she didn't commit suicide. She passed away from smallpox shortly after him. The story of Beth is well known and widely documented. It's been featured in books, TV shows, and magazines about paranormal activity. The hotel that now stands on the site proudly acknowledges Beth and the other ghosts who linger there. They actually benefit from it. It's a huge draw for visitors. The room where she died has a waiting list of over a year for reservations. Beth is the most commonly seen apparition, often a misty girl in a nightgown, and violin music is frequently heard drifting through the building. I know all this to be true because my family has lived in Abington for over 150 years, and I worked as the marketing and PR director for Martha Washington for 3 years. I hate to see such misinformation spread, especially about my hometown. Abington, Virginia, is one of the oldest towns in the U.S., and though I haven't had a personal experience with the supernatural, many people I know have, including my 5th grade teacher. The town, once called Wolf Hill, has a lot of haunted places, but there's one ghost story that stands out to me the most. It's about Henrietta, who's often called the singing ghost. Around 150 years ago, General Johnson built a large mansion for his family. After his death, his wife and children sold the house, and it became the Martha Washington College for Women. Everything went smoothly for years until the Civil War brought fighting and wounded soldiers to Abington. The college was evacuated, but a few girls stayed behind to care for the soldiers. One of them was Henrietta Collins, who kept her emotions in check until one day, when they brought in a certain soldier. Henrietta felt a connection to him right away. He was badly wounded and required more care than most. She took it upon herself to look after him, and one of the things she did was sing to him to help soothe him. As the days went by, Henrietta fell in love with the soldier, but his health only worsened, and eventually, he died in her arms. She sang to him until the very end. A few days later, another nurse found Henrietta's lifeless body in the same room where the soldier had passed. She had taken her own life, unable to bear the loss. To this day, some people say you can hear her singing at night, mourning the love she lost. If you listen closely, you might even hear her crying, still holding on to the memory of that soldier she loved so much. I must have been around 11 or 12 years old when this happened. One summer, my sisters, our cousin, and I went up north to visit our grandmother. She was involved in a strange religion that had a lot of unusual practices, things that seemed hard to explain. She had a friend, another member of her church, who lived directly above her. One evening, we went to visit this friend, and as soon as we stepped inside, we noticed something odd. Candles were burning in every room. It gave us all the creeps. We started talking to her, and the conversation somehow shifted to family members who had passed away. My father had died when I was just 2 years old, and I didn't really remember him, but I told her a story my mom had once shared with me. She told me that after he died, the night after he was murdered, he came to her in a vision. He told her to take care of me, and that he would always love her. But when she looked away, he was gone. This seemed to make our friend uneasy. She told us that when someone dies, we should let them stay dead. She said that if a family member ever came back, it wasn't really them, it was an evil spirit trying to deceive us. We should never speak to it. That night, we all went to bed, thinking about what she had told us. It must have been around 1 a.m. when my cousin woke me up to go with her to the bathroom. I agreed, and when we returned, I fell back asleep quickly. But not long after, I woke up to my sister's voice. She whispered urgently, "Do you see it? Don't look up, Kenya." I heard a strange, heavy breathing sound and, before we knew it, we were all screaming. It was just me, my sister, and our cousin awake. My other sister was still asleep. The sounds we heard were terrifying, a dragging noise, followed by what sounded like claws scratching and wings flapping against the window. I was too scared to move, but somehow I found the courage to turn on the light. We all just sat there, terrified, screaming for what felt like 5 minutes straight. When we finally spoke about what happened, we realized that each of us had experienced something different. My sister said she heard a loud sigh from the front door, as if something had just entered and was relieved to be inside. Then, whatever it was walked into our room and stood over me, just staring at me. Our cousin remembered only the frantic screaming and the strange scratching and flapping noise at the window. My other sister, who had been sound asleep, only woke up when I turned on the light. As for me, I truly believe this was an evil entity that had somehow entered the house, perhaps summoned by all of our questions and doubts. To this day, my sister, the one who was awake, and I still talk about that night. And whenever we do, we both get goosebumps, just remembering the fear we felt. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. "5 years ago, I went on vacation with my best friend, her brother, his fiancée, and their cousin. Unfortunately, my car broke down, and we were stuck. None of us were old enough to rent a car, and we had no way to get out of the situation. I knew my parents were on vacation in Florida, but there was no way to reach them directly. The only option was to call my dad's sister, who lived about 45 minutes away, and ask her to pass along the message. I called her, and she promised to let my parents know, but as soon as I made the call, I felt this overwhelming sense of dread. I brushed it off, thinking I was just upset about the breakdown, stuck 20 miles away from the beach in a shabby hotel room, sharing space with a couple who couldn't stop fighting. The next day, my dad called. He told me that my Uncle Bobby had been on his way to pass the message to my parents when he had a stroke. He'd crossed the road in his car and hit another vehicle. Both men died instantly. Uncle Bobby was 62. I took the news hard. I blamed myself for calling him. I spent years feeling guilty, wondering if I could have somehow prevented it. Then, about a week ago, something happened that changed everything. I was lying in bed, with my husband asleep beside me, when I woke up. I thought I heard the baby crying, so I opened my eyes. To my surprise, standing in the doorway of our room was the most beautiful man, glowing in a soft yellow light. It only took a second for me to focus and realize that it was Uncle Bobby. Since I've had other experiences with the paranormal, I wasn't scared. I was just intrigued. I lay there quietly, watching him watch me. Then, in my mind, he didn't speak aloud, he said, "I told Peggy I would be leaving her soon. It was my time. I don't want you to carry the guilt of my death anymore. It's been with you long enough. Peggy never blamed you. You're still her favorite niece. Call her." And just like that, he faded away. But there was a distinct scent that lingered in the air, the tobacco he used to smoke when I was a child. It was comforting. I felt a deep sense of peace and serenity wash over me. I began to cry, realizing that my guilt, all these years, had kept me from reaching out to my favorite person in the world. I hadn't called her because I was too wrapped up in that self-blame. The next day, I picked up the phone and called her. We've lived in our current home for almost 5 years now. When we first moved in, I honestly expected some kind of paranormal activity. The house dates back to the early 1900s, and all the homes in this area were built around the same time by a logging company. Back then, everyone who lived here worked for that company. They didn't have to go far for anything: groceries, furniture, even movies. Everything was right here. And oddly enough, my husband's parents actually lived in one of these houses before he was born. A quirky little tidbit: this tiny sawmill community even made it into Ripley's Believe It or Not because every house here had a fence around it. Strange, right? Our house has been home to many families over the years. In the old days, when people didn't have easy access to doctors, many people died at home, surrounded by their loved ones. I'm sure at least 2 people died here. One was a mother who passed away after a full life, and the other was her son, who died in his late 50s from cancer. We bought the house from the 3rd-generation son who had lived here his entire life. After his father passed away, he came into some money and spent a lot of it renovating the place. The house used to be a small, 2-bedroom home with high 12-foot ceilings. Now, it's got 4 bedrooms, with 2 rooms leading off from either side of the large living room. My daughter's room is one of the original bedrooms, and it's just perfect for her: lots of windows, high ceilings. Considering my past experiences with the paranormal, I thought living here would be a lot like something out of the Amityville Horror. But for almost 5 years, nothing unusual has happened. That is, until a couple of weeks ago. My husband works nights, so I usually go to bed when my daughter does. I sleep in her room because the house is so big, and I like being nearby in case she needs me. I've also gotten into the habit of taking naps during the day. After she heads off to school, I climb into her bed and sleep like a baby. Her bed is an antique that used to belong to the woman who passed away here. I think she might be back. One afternoon, I was getting comfortable for my nap, rain falling softly outside, perfect nap weather. I was almost asleep when I heard footsteps approach the room and stop at the foot of the bed. I didn't move. I was too afraid to. The footsteps continued around to the side of the bed and stopped again. Then I felt something move near my feet, like someone was straightening the covers. Suddenly, everything went quiet. I was alone again. As I tried to relax and convince myself it was just my imagination, the footsteps started again. This time, I could actually feel the presence. The footsteps passed between the bed and the fan I had blowing towards me. For a second, the air stopped, and I could feel them, whoever or whatever it was, standing close by. I didn't feel scared, though. It was more like they were checking on me, maybe making sure I was comfy and cozy. Who knows? But I didn't move, and they left again. A few minutes passed, and sure enough, the footsteps returned. At that point, I was really freaked out. I was too scared to move, so I just grabbed my pillow and buried my head, praying that God would keep me safe. I didn't dare look up to see if I could actually see anything. I stayed completely still until I felt alone again. When the room felt empty, I shot out of that bed like I was in a race. I felt pretty foolish afterward, so I didn't tell anyone about my visitor. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. But since then, it's happened 2 more times. Same thing: footsteps, movement around my feet, then silence. I'm pretty sure my naptime visitor is the old lady who passed away here. I don't think she's here to scare anyone. It's unsettling, sure, and it's messed with my daily routine a little, but maybe I should just scoot over and make room for her on the bed. My friends and I came up with a plan. We told the front desk that we were looking for a venue to host a bridal shower and asked if there were any penthouses that would fit about 10 people. The receptionist, after a little convincing, agreed to show us one of the penthouses. She even mentioned that it was the same room where Al Capone had reportedly stayed for a while. We took the elevator up to the 6th floor, then changed to another one to get to the 13th floor. That's when we started to feel a little uneasy. The elevator doors closed slowly, which seemed normal for an older building, but then things started to feel off. The lights inside the elevator flickered and dimmed, and the elevator stopped moving. We all exchanged nervous glances, but after what seemed like an eternity, the elevator jerked up to the 13th floor, but the doors didn't open. Suddenly, the elevator dropped back down to the 6th floor, and then shot back up to the 13th floor again. We were all a little freaked out at that point, but the receptionist just gave us a strange smile and said, "Well, here we are," as the doors finally opened. As we stepped out into the hallway, the phone inside the penthouse rang. Now, why would the front desk transfer a call to a room that wasn't even registered? We went inside, and as soon as we walked in, we noticed how cold the room was. The air conditioning was running, even though there were no guests checked into the room. It was just off. As we explored the penthouse, it felt like someone was there with us. The air was thick with a strange, eerie presence. We were all quiet, trying to take it in, when suddenly the piano keys rang out, playing a few eerie notes on their own. That's when the receptionist, looking visibly uncomfortable, suggested we should head back downstairs. We all piled back into the elevator, and as we turned around to face the doors, we heard the piano playing again, this time, much clearer. The seconds stretched on as we frantically pressed the button to close the doors. When they finally did, we were back at the 6th floor, then back to the lobby. The receptionist, looking shaken, admitted that she, too, felt something strange in that room, something she couldn't explain. As we left the hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Looking up at the building, it almost felt as if thousands of faces were staring down at us from the windows. Needless to say, we haven't been back since, but I have to admit, part of me still wants to go back and investigate the eerie happenings of the Biltmore Hotel. This tale takes place in a small farmhouse just outside of Dalton, New York, where my grandparents lived. My grandmother owned a simple two-story house, with a basic layout, 2 bedrooms on the first floor, a bathroom, a kitchen, a dining room, and a family room. The upstairs had 5 bedrooms, and there were 2 stairways leading to it, one from the kitchen and another from the living room. From the moment I could walk, I spent a lot of time in that house, along with my many cousins, 33, to be exact. But even as a child, I dreaded the thought of going to bed. I wasn't scared of monsters or the dark, though. No, my fear was something far worse. Every time I had to go upstairs, I could hear whispers, like chanting in low, indecipherable voices. Sometimes, I'd see red eyes staring out from the shadows, watching me. The eerie sensation only stopped once I reached my bed, pulled the covers over my head, and tried to block out the whispers. As the years went by, I grew older and smarter, but my fear of the upstairs never went away. The back staircase, which led up from the kitchen, was made of 23 steep steps of solid oak. The stairwell was pitch black, there was no light. At the top of the stairs, there was a large hallway with a bedroom to the left, which was used for storage, and another room straight ahead. That room was the worst. Every time I climbed those stairs, when I reached the 23rd step, I would leap over it, landing in the hallway. I had heard a story about an old woman who had fallen down those stairs and broken her neck. She lay there for a week or more before anyone found her. Every time I reached that 23rd step, I felt as if something was trying to push me backwards or yank my feet out from under me. Then, one cold night during Christmas vacation, I was sent upstairs to grab some wrapping paper. As I reached the 23rd step, I was suddenly struck by a pale blue face that leaped out of the bedroom at the top of the stairs. It pushed me backwards with a scream, and I tumbled down the stairs, crashing into the wall at the bottom. I felt no pain, despite having broken my arm. All I could focus on was that face. It was glowing, its expression twisted into an evil grin, and it started to move down the stairs toward me. I screamed in terror, and as I did, the kitchen door opened. My grandmother appeared, looking worried, asking, "What's going on?" Before I could even tell her about the woman's face, I realized it had disappeared. I picked myself up off the floor, wiped the blood from my forehead with a damp rag, and sat on a stool in the kitchen, waiting for my grandmother to get dressed so she could take me to the hospital. Just then, I heard someone walking through the living room. Thinking it was my grandmother, I yelled, "Hey, Grandma, you ready to go?" But then, I remembered she was still in the bathroom. I froze, and that's when I heard the most chilling, blood-curdling laugh echoing from the stairwell. I fainted. When I woke up, I found myself outside, sitting in my grandmother's car, my arm in a sling. Whatever that thing was on the stairs, I know it meant to kill me. I still get chills when I close my eyes. All I can see is that cold, hellish stare from that face. Since then, I've never gone upstairs again. If I absolutely have to, I take the front staircase in the living room, but I'll never go near the back stairs again. My name is Amy Rude, and as of 1998, I am 15 years old. I was around 7 or 8 years old when I had an experience that I still can't forget, and to this day, it haunts me. I saw a spirit in my bedroom, and the strange part is, I was the only one who ever saw it. My family often admitted to hearing footsteps around our small Rambler home, footsteps that no one could explain, but when it came to the spirit, I was the only one who encountered it. At the time, our house wasn't the kind of place that would immediately scream haunted to anyone who walked by. It was just a normal, suburban house in a quiet neighborhood. So, naturally, when I told my family about what I saw, they were skeptical. They chalked it up to me having an overactive imagination, especially since I was so young. But I know what I saw. Only I can make that conclusion because I was the one who experienced it. My mom, being comforting as always, suggested it might have been my guardian angel, but I wasn't so sure. What I saw terrified me. It was early in the morning, probably around 6 a.m. I was always the first one up, waiting quietly in bed until someone else woke up. I didn't get out of bed or do anything, I just sat there, staring into the quiet of the room. That's when I saw it. I looked over my shoulder and, for just a moment, I saw a woman walking through my door. My mom always closed the door at night so the TV wouldn't keep me up, so I was certain no one could come in. But there she was. She was wearing a long skirt, something that looked like it belonged to an old-timey, pioneer-style woman. But the thing that chilled me the most? She had no face. Her face was just a black void, an empty hole where a face should have been. And she was coming into my room. The instant I saw her, I panicked and buried my head under the pillow, trembling with fear. I couldn't move, couldn't even look. I never saw the figure again, but the memory stayed with me, deeply unsettling me. From that moment on, I was always scared in that house. There were other times, especially when I was home alone, when I'd feel a deep, irrational fear, a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I'd often find myself sitting on the front lawn, staring at the house, too scared to go back inside. It was like the house was watching me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt unwelcome there. The house never felt like it was my home, and it felt like something or someone was always there, just watching. Whenever I was questioned about it, I'd just shrug and say, "The house is scaring me." By the time we moved out when I was around 10, I was more than ready to leave. I couldn't wait to get away from it. But even now, I still get the chills thinking about that house. It felt like the house had eyes, like it was alive in some way. What bothers me, though, is why I was the only one who saw the spirit. Why did it seem to happen only when I was alone? When my father first bought the house, I thought it was going to be a fresh start for our family. The previous owner warned us that some strange things had happened in the house that no one could explain. She said that the family before us had seen odd occurrences. My father, however, shrugged it off, thinking it was just the eccentricities of the neighborhood and the people who lived there. For the first year, everything seemed fine. We settled in, and life went on. But that all changed one morning when I was home alone. I had just finished cleaning and walked out of the bathroom with a basket of dirty clothes. I set the basket down by the door and shut it behind me. Then, I began to carry the clothes halfway down the stairs when, out of nowhere, the bathroom door creaked open. My heart raced. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. I quickly left the door open, trying to shake off the unease. The next day, my sister and I were in my room watching TV when the bathroom door opened again. We stared at each other, wide-eyed, frozen in fear. The door started opening and closing, by itself, over and over again for about 5 seconds. We didn't know what to think. I grabbed my sister's hand and bolted downstairs, my heart pounding. We ran outside to the sidewalk and stood there, staring at the window. But there was nothing unusual. Nothing out of place. Just then, a neighbor walked up to us, looking calm and unfazed. He said, "Don't worry about it. They're friendly, as long as you ignore them." I asked him what he meant, and he casually replied, "Ghosts." At that point, I didn't believe in ghosts, so I just shrugged it off. Maybe he was just some strange, superstitious old man. But things would get worse. The following week, my father came to me, looking a bit shaken. He told me that he'd seen something white in his bedroom. He didn't go into detail, but he seemed unsettled by it. He even had a specialist come over to inspect the house. The specialist checked each bedroom, and when they got to mine, they found something strange, a black spot on the wall. I knew it wasn't there the day before. It wasn't dust or dirt. It was a solid, unnaturally dark spot. I reached out and touched it. To my shock, it was freezing cold, as if the spot itself was somehow absorbing all the warmth from the room. My blood ran cold. That was enough for my father. He decided it was time to move, and we packed up and left. I don't know what was in that house, but I'm glad we got out. I often wonder about the strange things that happened there, what it was, what it wanted, and why it only made its presence known when we were alone. All I know is, I'm glad I don't have to live through that nightmare anymore. It was the beginning of summer in 1977, and I had just gotten home from school. I walked through the front door and called out, like I always did, "Mom? Dad? Anyone home?" Of course, no one was there. I wandered through the house, making my way up the stairs, just like I did every day after school. When I reached the top, I changed out of my school clothes and started to head back down. As I walked towards the stairs, I heard a strange noise. We had these old stairs with ledges on both sides, and directly above me was the attic. I paused for a moment, looking down the hall from the top of the stairs, and then made my way back down. But as I took one step, I missed it entirely, my foot slipped, and I tumbled down the stairs. I landed hard, right on my backside, and then rolled, head first, into the downstairs door. I didn't know how long I was out, but when I finally came to, everything was blurry at first. I turned my head and saw something that made my heart skip a beat. In the living room, to the left of the entryway, was an old man sitting in my mom's rocking chair. It was a chair that had been in our family for as long as I could remember, one of those old, wooden ones that creaked when you rocked in it. The man didn't look solid, though. He was kind of misty, like you could see right through him. I couldn't really describe what he looked like, he was just there. He looked at me with a calm smile and said, "It'll be all right, fella." And then, just like that, he disappeared. I sat there, frozen, for a moment, not really sure what to make of it. After a while, I got up, walked over to the couch, and lay down. I don't know how long I'd been out from the fall, but when my parents woke me up, it was already around 8 p.m. and I was still sleeping on the couch. Not long after that, I came down with a terrible stomach flu. It kept me awake for days, and I couldn't shake the feeling of it. Strangely, just as soon as I got a new pair of cleats I had been wanting, the flu went away. I was only 7 years old when this happened, and now, at 28, it still feels as fresh as if it happened yesterday. It's an experience that's haunted me for years, and even though I've told only a few people, most of them just stare at me like they're not sure what to believe. But I always tell them the same thing: if it wasn't real, it sure felt like it was. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. This story was shared by an acquaintance of my significant other. The main person involved, Karen, had come home on leave from the armed forces and was visiting old friends who had organized a small gathering in her honor. As the evening wore on, people began leaving, and soon only Karen, her friend Vicky, and the homeowner Mary remained. At some point, Mary left the room to get something, and Vicky stepped into the bathroom. When they returned to the living room, they noticed that Karen was nowhere to be found. They called out her name, but there was no response. Growing concerned, they decided to search the house to find her. Mary went out to the backyard, and it didn't take long before she found Karen sitting on a stairstep, hunched forward with her elbows on her knees and her hands covering her face. She was rocking back and forth. Mary immediately rushed over, asking, "Karen, are you okay?" But Karen didn't respond. She just kept rocking, hands covering her face with an unnatural strength. Mary attempted to pry Karen's hands away, but Karen held on with extraordinary force. After some struggle, Mary managed to free Karen's hands, and when she looked at her face, she was horrified. It wasn't Karen's face anymore, it was something evil. Mary described the face as being twisted and malevolent, something she would never forget. Terrified, she shouted for Vicky, who had a reputation for being sensitive to the supernatural. Vicky rushed over, and the two of them managed to drag Karen inside. Slowly, Karen started to come around as Vicky worked to expel the entity from her. Vicky told Mary that she felt an overwhelmingly dark and powerful presence clinging to Karen. When Karen regained some clarity, she told them she had seen a tall, dark figure dressed entirely in black. The figure had been chasing her, taunting her, saying, "I'm gonna get you. I'm gonna get you." Karen tried to run, but the shadowy figure caught up with her. Despite the terrifying experience, Mary insisted that Karen stay the night at her house, and Vicky decided to stay as well, both wanting to ensure Karen's safety. Later that evening, as Karen sat on the couch watching TV, she suddenly screamed in terror. "My God, he's back," she cried, pointing at the ceiling. "He's up on the ceiling. He wants me." Vicky immediately looked up, and to her horror, she confirmed that Karen was seeing something. There, hovering above, was the dark figure Karen had described. Vicky's heart raced. This was the most frightening thing she had ever encountered. However, Mary saw nothing, only Karen's panicked reaction. Vicky quickly acted, using what she knew to try to banish the malevolent presence. After that night, the dark entity was gone, and nothing else strange occurred. Vicky's intervention seemed to have worked, and Karen eventually recovered from the terrifying experience. This story, as unbelievable as it may sound, is absolutely true according to my parents. I was young at the time, so I don't remember much, but I'll recount what they shared with me as best I can. My parents lived in a two-story home in southern Illinois, a house that was well over 100 years old when they moved in during the early 1970s. The upstairs had been just attic space when they bought the house, and my parents, both fresh-faced 18-year-olds, began remodeling it to make room for the growing family. During their renovation, they came across old pictures, a vintage train set, clothes, and other relics of the past items they, perhaps foolishly, threw out. As my mother was pregnant with me, my father worked long hours on the renovation. He would come home after working the graveyard shift, head upstairs, and continue wiring and building walls. That's when the strange occurrences began. It started subtly. Tools would go missing, his hammer, for example. He'd set it down in one place, and when he turned his back, it would be gone. When he retraced his steps, the hammer was always found somewhere else, sometimes even in another room. As time went on, my father began to feel the presence of someone watching him, not in a hostile way, but in a way that made him uneasy, as though someone was standing just behind him. To cope, he decided to bring a radio up to the attic to distract himself. But this only made things stranger. The radio, while playing normal music, would suddenly pick up strange, indecipherable feedback almost like the sounds of a ham radio or a CB. It wasn't clear speech, but it definitely had the cadence of human voices. After several strange occurrences, my father, ever the skeptic, decided to respond to the mysterious voices, trying to carry on a conversation. When he said things like, "Oh, really? Is that right?" the noise would pause, as if waiting for a response. Oddly, when my father mentioned he was too busy to talk, the noise would immediately stop and not return for the rest of the day. After I was born, the activity ramped up. My bedroom was at one end of the hallway upstairs, while my parents' room was at the other end. The renovation was nearly complete, save for one room between our two bedrooms. My father, now working days, began hearing strange sounds late at night. Despite the hallway being carpeted, he could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing back and forth in the hall, as if someone were keeping watch. These footsteps were steady, deliberate, not fast, but not dragging either. For a long time, my mother couldn't hear them until one night, my father woke her up to listen. As soon as he touched her arm, she could hear them too. Then one night, something even stranger happened. My father was finishing the last touches in the middle room. It was dark outside, and the moonlight was streaming through the window. He'd finished for the night, but as he was leaving, he noticed a nail that still needed hammering. Being a perfectionist, he grabbed his hammer and decided to finish it by the light of the moon, not bothering to turn the overhead light back on. As he stood up to leave, he froze. In the doorway, he saw a glowing outline of a person, about 6 feet tall. It was just an outline, no face, no details, almost like a ghostly silhouette, but clearly human in shape. He didn't feel frightened, just curious. After about 10 seconds, the figure simply vanished without a trace. By the time I was 3 years old, the ghost seemed to be particularly drawn to me. My parents started noticing things disappearing from the crawl space above the attic, things like my grandmother's white mink coat, expensive baby shoes, and even a gold locket. And it wasn't just random items, they were important, sentimental things. As if the ghost had a taste for the finer things in life. I also began to talk about my friend a lot. My parents would often hear me speaking to someone in my room. When they asked who I was talking to, I'd simply say, my friend. They'd press for details, and I'd say, the friend who lives here with me. My parents, understandably, were both perplexed and concerned. They asked me more questions, but I never spoke of any other imaginary friends outside my room. The most chilling experience came during a time when my mother had to take a job to help support the family. She hired a babysitter, but the woman turned out to be more trouble than anyone could have imagined. She threw wild parties, had a boyfriend who was an ex-convict, and drank heavily. My mother had no idea about the babysitter's lifestyle until one day, she found an open letter sitting on the kitchen table. The letter had been taken out of its envelope and was left there, intentionally exposed. It was odd because no one but my parents had access to the house, yet somehow this letter had been placed there for them to find. When my mother read the letter, she discovered the babysitter had been planning a wild party, and it was clear from the contents that things were about to go south. I've always believed that the ghost somehow intervened, leaving that letter out in the open for my parents to find. It was as if it was protecting me, warning them about the dangerous situation. In 1990, my wife and I were on a trip to Kenya. One of the stops on our itinerary was the governor's camp in the Masai Mara, a well-established safari camp that had hosted figures like Teddy Roosevelt and Ernest Hemingway. Our accommodations consisted of a large wood-frame tent, which included separate cots for sleeping. There was no electricity, and the camp's remote location lent an air of tranquility, but the events we experienced would soon prove otherwise. One night, I was asleep and dreaming about being chased by an animal, likely some kind of wild game from the region. Suddenly, I woke up with a start. Opening my eyes, I saw a strange sight. There, hovering at the foot of my bed, was an older, bearded white man. He was bathed in an eerie, white light, and though his face and upper body were clearly visible, his lower half seemed to fade away into the darkness. He appeared to be dressed in a safari jacket, the kind one might expect from someone who had lived in Africa decades ago. I sat up in bed, instinctively reaching for the kerosene lamp, but when I looked back, the figure was gone. At first, I thought I must have imagined it. I woke my wife and told her what I had seen, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been tricked by some kind of optical illusion. We talked it over, rationalizing that it was probably nothing, a trick of the light, or perhaps a vivid dream that blurred into wakefulness. I told my wife I felt a little disappointed in myself for not having been brave enough to confront the figure directly, to look it in the eye so I could understand what it really was. After a while, I managed to settle back down. I climbed back into my cot and eventually drifted back to sleep. But then, hours later, something far more disturbing happened. I woke again, this time to see an elderly white woman hovering over the end of my bed. She, too, was bathed in a soft, white light. Like the man, she was dressed in safari attire, and again, her lower body seemed to disappear into the darkness. I sat up in a panic, shouting, "Look! Look!" to my wife. It took her a moment to respond, and by the time she did, she started screaming hysterically. I immediately grabbed the kerosene lamp and turned it on, but once again, the figure had vanished. Both of us were shaken. After we calmed down, my wife explained something that struck me as even more unnerving. She told me that when I first screamed for her to look, she had been in the middle of a dream where she was being chased by an animal just as I had been. She had also experienced sleep paralysis, where she was unable to wake herself up, but she could sense that something else was in the tent with us. When she was finally able to open her eyes, she saw a glowing light dancing between our cots, but she couldn't make out a face. What she did see was enough to send her into a panic. In recounting the experience, I often say two things. First, I tell people, don't take my word for it. When you see it for yourself, you'll know that ghosts exist. And second, I express my regret that when the first encounter happened, I didn't have the courage to confront the apparition. I was disappointed in myself for not having the strength to stare down the figure. But when the woman appeared again, I was just as frightened, and once again, I couldn't summon the courage to prolong the encounter. Since that night, my wife and I have speculated about what we experienced. Some think that the couple we saw, this elderly man and woman, could have been people who perished while on safari. Perhaps they had died in the area, and their spirits remained near the camp, forever tied to that place. Others have suggested that what we experienced might have been some kind of time distortion, where the past and present briefly overlapped, allowing us to see these figures from a different era. It's a theory that, while speculative, gives us some comfort in trying to make sense of what happened. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. A couple of years ago, my friend Danon and I were having a sleepover at my aunt's house. We had spent a fun-filled day swimming and playing, and as night fell, we gathered around a bonfire with my aunt, grandma, mom, and our dog. As the fire crackled, we swapped stories about my grandpa, who's the main spirit in this story, and Danon shared stories about her dad, who had also passed away. After a while, we got bored and decided to head inside. We went to the spare room, changed into our pajamas, and got ready for bed. At the time, we were both about 10 or 11 years old and were obsessed with little toys called baby animals. These were tiny figures of different animals that came with candy and stickers. To fully understand the story, I need to describe the room where we were. When you walked in, directly ahead was an old dresser holding cloth napkins and table covers for parties. The double bed was in the far left corner of the room. In the left-hand corner, closest to the door, was another dresser with a mirror on top. Beside the mirror dresser, there was a chair placed between the dresser and the door. Above the chair, a bouquet of fake roses hung in a small cloth bag. I was sitting on the bed playing with my baby animals, while Danon stood at the foot of the bed, brushing her hair in front of the mirror. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. The flowers above the chair began to move slowly at first, then they turned around completely, 180 degrees. I hadn't seen it happen at first, as I was distracted by my toys, but when I turned to ask Danon something, I saw her reflection. Her eyes were wide with fear, and her mouth was agape. She stood frozen, watching the flowers turn by themselves, without any breeze or open window to explain it. I followed her gaze and looked up at the flowers, and sure enough, they stopped moving just as abruptly as they had started. We were both so shaken that we decided to get into bed, hoping that the calm of sleep would help take our minds off of what we had just seen. But as we lay there, we could still hear faint voices and distant laughter coming from the bonfire outside, as though our grandfathers were trying to keep us aware of their presence. Then, something even stranger happened. The shadows on the walls and ceiling seemed to shift on their own. It was as though they were trying to get our attention, but they only scared us more. Eventually, one of the spirits decided to show itself in a different way. It appeared to float out of a picture frame above the bed, just a white, flowing, translucent gown or dress, drifting through the air before disappearing into nothing. At that moment, I realized that I had experienced something I had only heard about in stories, an encounter with a spirit. I had touched spirits before, or at least felt their presence. The sensation of a spirit is different each time, but I've learned to recognize it. When a spirit is near, I get this tingling feeling, almost like when your foot falls asleep and it starts waking up. It's a strange, almost painful sensation of pins and needles, but 20 times stronger. It's like you can feel the energy in the room shifting. That night, we knew our grandfathers were trying to get our attention, but they didn't realize they were just scaring us more. As an excuse to leave the room, we went into the kitchen to grab a glass of water. We brought the glasses back with us to the bedroom, hoping the spirits would leave us alone. But they didn't. About 5 minutes later, the bed started shaking, like someone was trying to rock it. Dan and I turned to each other, asking if the other was moving, but we were both completely still. It was as if the spirits were trying to make their presence known again. Freaked out, we ran down to the bonfire and sat with my mom until we felt safe enough to go back to bed. The next morning, I decided to test whether the spirits had truly been with us the night before. I picked up the glasses of water and asked if one or both of my grandpa and Danan's dad were in the room last night, make the water ripple. If my grandpa was here, make my water ripple, and if it was Danan's dad, make hers ripple. Without warning, both glasses began to ripple. It was a moment of eerie confirmation for both Danan and me. This October, I was fortunate enough to take a trip to Scotland with my sister, Sheila. It was truly a once-in-a-lifetime journey. My mother had passed away in 1996, and I had promised her that one day, I'd send her to Europe. I never had the chance to fulfill that promise when she was alive. But this trip became my way of honoring her memory. I decided to take a crystal from her grave in Santa Fe, New Mexico, with us to Scotland, a small but meaningful token to keep her close on this adventure. We began our trip in Edinburgh and made our way up to Stirling Castle, where we stayed for 2 days. Stirling Castle is where William Wallace first fought the English on Stirling Bridge, over the Firth of Forth. It was exactly what you'd imagine from an old Scottish castle, tall, cold stone walls that still stand strong, surrounding the city. The castle had once been the royal palace for the Scots, and it was also where Mary Queen of Scots spent part of her youth, in a kind of secluded, prison-like existence. Our guest house was built into the city walls of the castle, along a street called the Back Walk. The place was called the Woodside, and it was one of the few places to stay in the area. When we arrived, we were surprised to find that our rooms were on the very top floor of the guest house, right at the top of the castle wall. This wasn't exactly ideal for me, as I'm partially disabled, and the climb was steep. But we decided to push on and, after a long day, went to eat at a local pub before heading back to our chilly room. The beds in the Woodside were as old as the castle itself. I ended up sharing a bed with Sheila that night, hoping the management would provide us with a more comfortable mattress soon. The room was incredibly cold, and my bed was right next to a set of high windows that overlooked the church steeple. These windows had been altered over time. Modern storm windows replaced the original ancient sashes. That night, there was an intense storm, rain, cold winds, and a constant howling noise that made the room feel even spookier. The atmosphere of the room, combined with the storm outside, was enough to send us both to sleep quickly, just to escape the chill. Around 1 a.m., I woke up suddenly. The room, which had been freezing just hours before, was now unbearably hot. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out whether I should get up and fiddle with the heating system, my eyes still closed. Then, without warning, I felt someone shake me by the arm, hard. My eye shot open, and I turned to ask Sheila what she needed. But she didn't answer. I could see she was still fast asleep. I shook her awake, asking if she had touched me. We were both quiet for a moment, listening. That's when we heard it, a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, moving across the room and out into the hallway. My heart raced as I jumped out of bed and rushed to the door. I opened it wide, but there was nothing there. Just silence. We stood there in the doorway for a moment, both of us unsure of what had just happened. Had it been a ghost? Was it just the wind? I don't know, but I can't shake the feeling that something or someone was there with us that night. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. When I was 17, something happened to me that I still remember vividly, even though it's been many years. It was a time when I was dealing with schoolwork, stress, and a lot of confusion about life. But there was also something strange. Something that I can't quite explain, even to this day. It was November 1998, and I was up late, working on my AP English homework. My teacher was tough, always giving us more than enough to do, and I never seemed to get through it fast enough. I was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes your eyelids feel like weights, but I pushed through it, trying to finish before I went to bed. My hair kept falling in my eyes as I was growing out my bangs, which only added to my frustration. But I kept writing, determined to get it done. As I closed my books and stretched, finally ready to head to bed, I heard a soft tap at my bedroom door. Then a voice called, "Melanie, what are you doing still up?" It wasn't my parents. They knew I'd be up late working, and they also knew I wouldn't go to bed until everything was finished. So I thought it was odd. I looked up, and there, standing in my doorway, was my grandfather. My paternal grandfather. The man who had passed away 7 years before. Only, he wasn't really there. I could see right through him, to the other side of the room. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Papa?" I whispered. "What are you doing here? You've been gone for so long. I miss you so much. Did you come to say goodbye?" He shook his head slowly, like he was trying to calm me down. "No, Melanie, I didn't come to say goodbye. I came to warn you about something. And yes, I know you loved me when I was alive. I know you still love me now." Tears welled up in my eyes as I stared at him. "What do you mean, Papa? What's going to happen?" His voice was gentle, yet serious. "Melanie, you're going to get burned. Really badly. It's going to scar you for life." I gasped, my hands shaking. "What? Why are you telling me this? How could this happen?" He stepped closer, his presence calming, though the warning weighed heavy in the air. "I couldn't let you go through this without knowing. I didn't want you to be caught off guard, to suffer without a chance to prepare." I wiped my eyes, still in disbelief. "But I miss you every day, Papa. I wonder where you are, if you're okay. I hope you're at peace." He smiled softly, his expression warm. "I'm usually in heaven, Melanie. But I wanted to make sure you knew that I'm okay and that I'm still here, looking out for you. I just couldn't stand knowing you might suffer without a warning. Sorry to interrupt. If you're enjoying the story, let me know in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more." I felt a strange calm as he walked toward me, reaching out and gently kissing my forehead. "I miss you, too, dear. And I can't wait until the day you'll join me up here. Just remember, your husband, he's coming from a different background than what your parents raised you with. But don't worry about that now. Just trust me on this." And just like that, he was gone. A few days later, I was at work, just going about my usual routine. I'm left-handed, so I was pouring a pot of hot coffee with my left hand, the way I always do. But that day, the pot tipped, and before I could stop it, the scalding coffee splashed onto my right breast. The burn was severe. It left a third-degree scar that I carry with me to this day. And worse, my right breast has never been the same. It still aches most days, and it's noticeable, especially compared to my left. Every time the pain flares up, I think of my grandfather. His ghostly warning. And oddly enough, I can't help but think about what he said about the man I would eventually marry. Years later, I did meet the love of my life. He's Catholic, and I was raised Baptist. It's strange how life works out sometimes, isn't it? But I always remember my grandfather's words. And I still wonder, even now, what else he might have known. It was January 20th, 1997, the day I turned 15, and I was at Operation Snowball with some of my closest friends. The weekend was designed to raise awareness about the dangers of drugs, alcohol, and smoking. But honestly, it was also a chance for us to get away from our parents and just have some fun. At that age, I was beginning to explore new things, especially the paranormal and psychic experiences, though I didn't have the right words for it back then. That night, my best guy friend, my best girlfriend, and I decided to skip the speaker. We knew it was going to be boring, and we were more interested in hanging out than listening to someone talk. The guy wanted to tune his guitar before the evening activities, so we all snuck backstage, hiding behind the curtains so no one would find us. Everything was fine at first. We were laughing and joking around, enjoying the quiet away from the crowd. Then, suddenly, my friend started shaking. Her eyes began fluttering like she couldn't keep them open. At first, I thought maybe she was just tired, but it quickly became clear something wasn't right. She started speaking in a strange voice, almost like someone who couldn't control their words. "Stop the music." "And no more," she said, but there was no music playing. We both stared at her, confused and scared. Then she told us not to go into the drama closet, or something terrible would happen. At that point, we definitely weren't planning to go in, but her warning only made us more uneasy. Her speech became harder to understand, and the more she talked, the more it felt like she wasn't even in control of her own voice. I remember feeling completely helpless, not knowing what to do. We promised her we wouldn't mess with the music, but then she just fainted. It all happened so fast. My friend and I tried everything we could to keep her awake, to make sure no one heard us or found us hiding behind the curtains. It felt like time was moving so slowly. After about a minute, she came to. She was disoriented, asking what had happened, and we told her everything. When we finished explaining, she told us she felt like she'd been trapped inside herself, like something had taken over her. That's when we realized what had happened. She'd been possessed. The idea sent chills down my spine, even though I didn't fully understand it at the time. I turned around, trying to focus on something else to get my mind off the fear. My gaze landed on the wall near the drama closet, and I froze. There, on the brick, was a small black spot. I wasn't sure why, but I couldn't look away. I just stared at it, my mind still reeling from what had just happened with my friend. And then, the spot started to grow. At first, it was slow, but soon it was expanding, spreading across the brick. I felt my stomach twist into knots. The spot grew larger and larger, until, suddenly, something started to emerge from it. I could hardly breathe. A hand, thin and skeletal, began to appear, its bony fingers stretching out of the wall. I was terrified, but I couldn't look away. It moved, slowly at first, and then it started turning, like someone turning a doorknob. I was paralyzed with fear. The hand stretched out farther, the fingers curling into a fist, except for the index finger. It was pointed straight at me, beckoning me closer. I couldn't stop myself. I began crying silently, feeling a mixture of fear and confusion. My friends saw it too, and I could tell they were just as terrified, but I was too shaken to ask them what they thought. I had to turn away from the hand. I couldn't look at it anymore. I just wanted to leave. The hand eventually disappeared, but the fear didn't leave with it. We decided to get out of there, but as we tried to slip away from the stage, I must have made a noise, maybe a soft gasp, or a step too loud. Either way, we got caught. Someone found us hiding, and we had to face the consequences of sneaking around. That night, I could hardly enjoy myself. All I could think about was what had just happened. The feeling of fear and confusion lingered with me long after the events of the evening. It wasn't until much later that I truly began to understand what had happened, what I had seen. But I knew one thing for sure, that was the most terrifying night of my life. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way. It had been 5 months since my husband and I separated. He passed away suddenly, from an overdose of alcohol and other substances. I couldn't stop blaming myself. I felt responsible for his tragic end, even though it wasn't really my fault. We had been trying to find our way back to each other after a huge argument, and he left to stay at his mother's house. I never imagined that would be the last time I saw him alive. When October rolled around, I was still overwhelmed by grief. The guilt weighed heavily on me. I hadn't come close to dealing with the loss. Then, a friend of mine, someone deeply spiritual and intuitive, came to stay with me and my daughter. She had a special connection with the metaphysical world, and her calm energy helped me feel a little less alone. One day, we decided to visit my husband's grave. I hadn't been there since the funeral, and I wasn't sure how I would feel. We stood there for a while, just letting the silence wash over us. Then, before we left, my friend suggested we say a prayer. We stood on his grave, back to back, and began. But within moments, something happened. I felt this powerful surge of energy rush through me. It was so sudden, so intense, that I was physically pushed backwards. I stumbled into my friend's back. It wasn't just a feeling, it was like a force moving through me. And in that instant, I knew. I could feel him. My husband's energy was flowing through me, as if his soul was right there, passing through mine. The sensation was almost more real than a memory, more vivid than any dream. I could feel his presence, his warmth, his scent, even the way his skin felt when I touched him. I could see his face in my mind's eye. Everything about him was so clear, so real, as though he were right in front of me. It was him. I was stunned, completely taken aback. My friend and I turned around to face each other, and it was obvious she had felt something too. She had sensed the energy, but it wasn't as strong as what I experienced. I knew in that moment that my husband hadn't truly gone. He was still with me. His presence was there, in some form, still lingering around me, still watching over me. That experience, as strange as it was, brought me peace. I felt a sense of serenity that I hadn't known since his death. It didn't erase the pain, of course. Losing my husband, and seeing our family fall apart, was a heavy burden. But on that day, in that moment, I knew he wasn't gone for good. His soul was still there, in some way, and I would carry that with me always. Now, I live with a quiet sense of knowing he's still here. I don't have to fear his absence. The love we shared, the bond we had, it hasn't ended. It's something I'll always carry with me. Hey everyone! I put a lot of effort and heart into creating these videos just for you. If you're enjoying the content, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a quick comment below and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Your support means the world to me, and it keeps me motivated to bring more awesome videos your way.